A millionaire's perfect wedding was interrupted when his mistress arrived with DNA test results. The shocking truth: she was his fiancée's long-lost twin sister, separated during a hospital evacuation. His secret affair had unexpectedly reunited a family while destroying his own future. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis glittered. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, honeyed light on the meticulously arranged tables, each draped in ivory linen and adorned with arrangements of blush roses and peonies. The air hummed with a low thrum of anticipation, a symphony of hushed conversations and clinking champagne flutes. Julian, however, felt a cold knot tightening in his stomach. The scent of lilies, usually so comforting, now felt cloying, a suffocating reminder of the lie he was living. Amelia, radiant in her designer gown, approached him, her smile a fragile thing, like spun glass. He saw a flicker of apprehension in her usually bright eyes, a subtle tremor in her hand as she reached for his. "You seem distant," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. He forced a smile, a practiced mask he'd perfected over years of navigating the treacherous waters of his double life. "Nonsense, darling. I'm just overwhelmed." The words felt hollow even to his own ears. The intoxicating thrill of Isabella's passion was a stark contrast to the quiet comfort he found in Amelia's gentle embrace, a comfort that now felt tainted, suffocating. A waiter offered Amelia a glass of champagne, its bubbles mirroring the turmoil bubbling inside Julian. He watched her take a delicate sip, the light catching the diamond pendant he'd gifted her, a symbol of a love he was betraying. The weight of his deceit pressed down on him, heavy and inescapable, threatening to shatter the carefully constructed facade of his perfect life. The faint strains of the wedding march began to play. His breath hitched. The wedding was about to begin. The perfect storm was about to break. The organ music swelled, a wave of sound that threatened to drown Julian in its tide. He squeezed Amelia's hand, the diamonds on her ring cold against his palm, a stark contrast to the feverish heat burning in his chest. Her smile, once radiant, had become strained, a delicate porcelain mask threatening to crack under the pressure. He saw the doubt reflected in her eyes, a painful mirroring of his own turmoil. "Julian," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the music. "Are you all right?" He forced a laugh, brittle and unconvincing. "Perfectly all right, my love. Just a little overwhelmed." The scent of lilies, roses, and champagne fought for dominance in the air, a heady mix that did little to soothe his anxiety. The shimmering ballroom, a spectacle of opulence, felt like a gilded cage. A sudden movement at the back of the room caught his eye. A figure emerged from the shadows, a vision of sleek black against the ivory and gold. Isabella, her face usually alight with passion, was pale and drawn, her eyes wide and filled with a desperate plea. She held a small, white envelope in her hand, the crispness of the paper a jarring counterpoint to the swirling chaos within Julian's mind. Amelia followed his gaze, her smile dissolving into a look of confusion. The music faltered, then stopped abruptly. A hush fell over the assembled guests, a tangible silence that hung heavy in the air. The sudden stillness was more deafening than the music had ever been. Isabella walked toward them, her steps measured, yet imbued with an urgent energy. The world seemed to slow, the glittering ballroom fading into a hazy blur as all eyes turned to her, their anticipation a palpable force. This wasn't the perfect wedding. This was a collision, a perfect storm about to unleash its fury. The envelope in Isabella's hand became a symbol of impending doom, a harbinger of the devastating truth about to shatter their lives. Isabella's voice, a tremor in the suffocating silence, broke the spell. "Julian," she whispered, her eyes pleading, fixed on Amelia's stunned face. The scent of lilies, heavy and cloying, seemed to mock the fragile beauty of the moment. Amelia's carefully constructed smile had crumbled, replaced by a mask of bewildered hurt. The diamonds on her ring, catching the weak light filtering through the arched windows, seemed to mock her happiness. This changes everything," Amelia breathed, her voice thin and reedy. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. Her hand, still clasped in Julian's, went limp, her fingers withdrawing as if burned. Julian felt a cold dread seep into his bones. The opulent ballroom, moments ago a symbol of his success, now felt like a suffocating prison. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny, to explain, but no sound emerged. His throat was choked with a mixture of guilt and terror. The champagne, earlier a symbol of celebration, now tasted like ash in his mouth. Isabella stepped closer, the white envelope clutched in her trembling hand. The crisp paper, a stark contrast to the swirling silks and satins of the wedding attire, seemed to amplify the starkness of the situation. Her eyes, usually sparkling with mischief and passion, were filled with a heartbreaking vulnerability. She looked older, suddenly burdened by a weight of secrets she could no longer bear. It's about Amelia, she began, her voice catching. A tear traced a path through the carefully applied makeup, a stark mark against the flawless porcelain of her skin. The sudden, unexpected intimacy of her vulnerability was a cruel irony, playing out against the backdrop of opulent destruction. It's about a sister, she managed to gasp, the words hanging between them like a fragile, barely audible promise of upheaval. The weight of the unspoken truth pressed down on them, a suffocating blanket of impending doom. The beautiful wedding cake, once a symbol of hope and the future, now seemed a monument to a shattered dream. The crystal chandeliers, reflecting a million shimmering lights, only served to intensify the stark shadows falling across their faces. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the erratic thumping of Julian's heart. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating as the scent of lilies. Amelia's breath hitched, a fragile sound lost in the cavernous ballroom. The diamond on her finger, a symbol of a future now dissolving, felt cold against her skin, a stark contrast to the burning humiliation rising within her. Julian, trapped in the spotlight of his own catastrophic mistake, felt the blood drain from his face. His carefully constructed facade, the mask of a successful, loving fiancé, crumbled, revealing the raw terror beneath. Isabella, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, clutched the envelope like a lifeline. The crisp white paper, a jarring symbol of stark reality against the opulent backdrop, seemed to vibrate with the weight of its secret. She shifted her weight, the silk of her dress rustling, a sound almost too delicate for the crushing weight of the moment. Her meticulously crafted composure, the practiced allure she usually projected, was shattered, replaced by a vulnerability so raw it was almost painful to witness. It's a DNA test, she whispered, her voice cracking. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The crystal chandeliers, glittering above, reflected the fractured pieces of their lives. Each glint of light seemed to mock their shattered happiness. The wedding cake, a magnificent confection, now seemed a grotesque parody of their ruined celebration. Its sugary sweetness felt sickening, a bitter aftertaste to the champagne that only moments before had symbolized a joyous future. Amelia finally spoke, her voice a mere tremor. A DNA test? What does it say? The question hung in the air, laced with a mixture of fear and a dawning, horrifying understanding. She looked from Julian, his face ashen and etched with guilt, to Isabella, whose vulnerability only heightened the unsettling strangeness of the situation. The ornate gold trim of the chairs seemed to mock the elegant tragedy unfolding before them. Isabella's gaze flickered to Julian, then back to Amelia. The tremor in her voice intensified. It says that we're sisters. The words hung between them, a stark revelation in the opulent silence. The weight of unspoken history, of shared trauma and separation, filled the room, heavier than any physical presence. The floral arrangements, once symbols of love and celebration, now seemed like elaborate funeral wreaths, their vibrant colors muted by the shadow of this unforeseen tragedy. The music, once a celebratory soundtrack to their impending union, faded into a distant, mournful echo. The champagne flutes, abandoned on the tables, reflected the shattered dreams of three individuals, caught in the wreckage of a life meticulously planned and spectacularly ruined. The ballroom, a breathtaking spectacle moments before, now felt like a suffocating cage. The scent of lilies, once intoxicating, now clung to the air like a shroud. Amelia, her face drained of color, stared at Isabella, her eyes wide with disbelief. The diamond on her finger felt like a cruel joke, a symbol of a future cruelly snatched away. The champagne flutes, abandoned on tables draped in ivory linen, mirrored the shattered fragments of their lives. Julian, his face ashen, opened his mouth to speak, but no sound escaped. Guilt clawed at him, a visceral pain that eclipsed the initial shock. He'd envisioned this day countless times, the culmination of a meticulously crafted life. Now it lay in ruins, a testament to his own reckless actions. Isabella, her carefully constructed composure crumbling, shifted her weight, the silk of her gown rustling like dry leaves underfoot. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the opulent ballroom into a hazy watercolor. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I only found out recently. The test, it was a miracle, really. A chance encounter." A single tear traced a path down Amelia's cheek, leaving a glistening trail through the meticulously applied makeup. Her breath hitched, a fragile sound swallowed by the stunned silence. "A miracle?" she repeated, her voice barely a breath. "You mean, you knew you were having an affair with my fiancé, and you didn't know you were my sister?" The accusation hung in the air, sharp and accusing. The weight of betrayal pressed down on them, heavier than the opulent chandeliers overhead. The once joyous music, a distant memory now, was replaced by the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of Julian's racing heart. He saw the hurt in Amelia's eyes, a hurt so profound it threatened to shatter him completely. He'd built his life on carefully constructed illusions, and now they were all crumbling around him. The meticulously crafted floral arrangements, once symbols of hope, felt like a mocking display of his ruined happiness. The exquisite details of the wedding now seemed grotesque parodies of a future that would never be. Isabella, her vulnerability palpable, stepped forward, her hand instinctively reaching out to Amelia, then retracting, unsure of how to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. The silence stretched, broken only by the soft sobs that escaped Amelia's lips. The opulent ballroom, once a stage for their perfect fairy tale, had transformed into a stark reminder of life's cruel unpredictability. The weight of the revelation hung heavy, casting a long, dark shadow over the lives of three individuals caught in the devastating aftermath of a truth no one could have foreseen. The carefully planned perfection of the wedding day was demolished, its fragments scattered across the polished marble floor like broken glass. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating like the scent of the wilting lilies. Amelia retreated, not physically, but emotionally, a fortress built of hurt and disbelief surrounding her. The champagne bubbles, once symbols of celebration, now mocked her with their fleeting effervescence. Each pop was a tiny explosion mirroring the shattering of her world. Julian watched her withdraw, the carefully crafted facade of his perfect life crumbling faster than the discarded wedding cake. He wanted to reach out, to soothe, to explain, but the words caught in his throat, choked by guilt. His touch, once so familiar and comforting to Amelia, now felt like a violation. Isabella, pale and trembling, watched the unfolding drama with a mixture of remorse and terror. Her carefully planned deception, intended to bring happiness, had instead unleashed a torrent of devastation. The silk of her dress, once a symbol of allure, felt like a heavy shroud. The opulent ballroom, a scene of planned perfection, now felt like a prison, its gilded cage trapping her in the wreckage of her own making. "It wasn't, I swear, it wasn't intentional," Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible above the throbbing silence. Her eyes, usually sparkling with mischief, were now filled with a desperate plea for understanding. She shifted her weight, the movement clumsy and hesitant, betraying her inner turmoil. Amelia finally spoke, her voice raw with pain. "Intentional or not, you stole something precious from me. You're my sister." The question hung in the air, heavy with disbelief, tinged with a chilling undercurrent of betrayal, so profound it felt almost surreal. The opulent setting seemed to mock their suffering, highlighting the stark contrast between the planned luxury and the raw emotion ripping through their lives. The crystal chandeliers, usually sparkling with a joyful radiance, now felt like cold, accusing eyes. The carefully arranged floral displays seemed grotesque in their juxtaposition to the unfolding emotional carnage. Julian opened his mouth to speak, to offer an explanation, a plea for forgiveness, but the words failed him. He was trapped, caught in the wreckage of his own making, the weight of his lies and deceit pressing down on him with crushing force. The meticulously planned wedding, once a symbol of his success, was now nothing but a monument to his failure. His perfect life, meticulously constructed, lay in ruins around him. The silence stretched, punctuated only by Amelia's quiet sobs, a heartbreaking counterpoint to the silent opulence of the room. The scent of lilies, now cloying and oppressive, clung to Amelia like a shroud. She sat, a statue of frozen grief, amidst the scattered remnants of a shattered dream. The champagne flutes, abandoned halfway to lips, seemed to mock the sudden emptiness. Julian, his tailored suit suddenly looking ludicrously out of place, reached for her hand. His touch, once a comforting caress, now felt like a brand. "Amelia, please," he began, his voice a ragged whisper against the suffocating silence. The words caught in his throat, choked by a guilt so profound it threatened to consume him. Amelia flinched away, her eyes, usually sparkling with warmth, now cold and accusing. "Don't," she breathed, the single word laden with a lifetime of hurt. "Don't touch me." Isabella, a ghost of her former alluring self, watched from the periphery, her own tears mirroring Amelia's. The opulent ballroom, once a stage for her carefully orchestrated deception, now felt like a cruel parody of her own shattered hopes. The silk of her dress, once a symbol of confidence, now felt like a suffocating weight. A single tear traced a path through the meticulously applied makeup on Isabella's face. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some semblance of explanation, some crumb of comfort, but the words died in her throat, lost in the echoing silence of the devastated ballroom. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, crushing the breath from her lungs. The shimmering crystal chandeliers, once symbols of celebration, now resembled icy daggers, their light reflecting off the unshed tears welling in her eyes. Julian watched them both, a vortex of despair swirling within him. He had built his life on a foundation of lies, a meticulously constructed illusion that had crumbled spectacularly. The perfect life he craved, the perfect wedding he'd planned, lay in ruins, all victims of his own reckless pursuit of pleasure. He felt the icy grip of regret tightening around his heart, a cold, unforgiving vice. He desperately wanted to undo it all, to erase the past, to rewrite his future. "It was a mistake," he finally managed to croak, the words sounding hollow and unconvincing even to his own ears. The admission lacked conviction even to himself. The silence that followed was broken only by the low, stifled sobs that escaped Amelia's lips. A wave of nausea washed over Julian. The weight of his betrayal, the stunning revelation of Isabella's identity, it all threatened to drown him in a sea of self-loathing. He looked from Amelia's heartbroken face to Isabella's haunted eyes, and for the first time, he saw not just the consequences of his actions, but the fragile, complex human beings he had so carelessly wounded. The opulent ballroom, a testament to his wealth, felt like a stark cage, trapping him in the wreckage of his own making. The carefully crafted illusion had shattered, leaving behind only the raw, bitter truth. The scent of lilies, still heavy in the air, fought with the metallic tang of blood. A small cut on Amelia's hand, unnoticed until now. Crimson bloomed against the pristine white of her dress, a stark symbol of the shattered perfection. Julian watched, helpless, as she dabbed at the wound with a trembling hand, the movement mirroring the tremor in her voice. "It's symbolic," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hushed sobs that now racked her body. Isabella, pale and drawn, stood frozen, a statue of guilt beside a discarded champagne flute. Julian's throat tightened. He wanted to reach for Amelia, to offer comfort, but the memory of Isabella's tear-stained face, her whispered confession of a life stolen, a sister lost, held him back. The opulence of the ballroom mocked their pain. The glittering chandeliers seemed to cast a cold, unforgiving light on their broken lives. "Amelia," he began again, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I can explain." She cut him off, her gaze unwavering, filled with a profound sadness that pierced him to the core. "There's nothing to explain, Julian. You chose her. Over me. Over us." The word "us" hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken promises and shattered dreams. The unspoken truth, that Isabella was Amelia's twin, hovered between them, a tangible presence in the suffocating silence. Isabella took a shaky step forward. "Amelia, please let me," she faltered, unable to articulate the torrent of emotions swirling within her: remorse, longing, and a desperate hope for understanding. Her eyes, wide and filled with unshed tears, mirrored Amelia's pain, a painful reflection of a shared trauma. Amelia's gaze shifted to Isabella, her expression a complex mixture of anger, betrayal, and a flicker of something else. Recognition, curiosity. The lingering scent of lilies suddenly felt suffocating, a cruel reminder of the perfect wedding that had imploded, leaving behind a wreckage of shattered hearts and a shocking truth. The weight of their shared history, a history both knew nothing about, hung heavy in the air, a silent promise of a future none of them could yet imagine. The shattered remnants of the wedding cake, once a symbol of their future together, now felt like a cruel omen of what was to come. The DNA results, stark and undeniable, lay on the silk tablecloth, a stark contrast to the pristine white of Amelia's wedding gown. The champagne flutes, once filled with celebratory bubbles, now sat abandoned, their contents spilled, mirroring the shattered dreams. Amelia's breath hitched, a sob catching in her throat. Her eyes, once sparkling with joy, were now wide with a hurt so profound it physically ached to witness. "Julian," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rising crescendo of whispered gasps from the stunned guests. The word hung in the air, heavy with accusation and disbelief. The opulent ballroom, moments before a haven of celebration, now felt like a suffocating tomb. Isabella, her face a mask of horrified regret, stammered, I didn't know. I swear. I didn't know she was your—" Her voice trailed off, unable to utter the devastating truth. The scent of lilies, once so intoxicating, now felt cloying, a cruel reminder of the idyllic fantasy that had been so brutally shattered. Julian, his face ashen, could only stare, his perfect world collapsing around him. The weight of his deceit, the intoxicating thrill of his affair with Isabella, now felt like a crushing burden. He reached for Amelia, his hand trembling, but she recoiled, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Get away from me," she hissed, her voice laced with icy fury. The delicate crystal of the chandelier seemed to tremble in sympathy with her rage, the light catching the diamond on her ring, a cruel reminder of vows broken before they were even spoken. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the muffled sobs of Isabella and the distant murmur of shocked onlookers. The opulent setting, the shimmering fabrics, the extravagant floral arrangements, suddenly seemed grotesque, mocking the raw, unfiltered emotion in the room. Julian felt a wave of nausea. His carefully constructed life, his perfect image, was crumbling before his eyes, and all that remained was the bitter taste of regret. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, heavy as the velvet curtains that framed this scene of utter devastation. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the erratic thump-thump-thump of Amelia's heart, a frantic drumbeat against the stillness. Crystal chandeliers, once sparkling symbols of joy, now seemed to weep with unshed tears, their light catching the diamond on her ring, a cruel, glittering mockery. The scent of lilies, previously heady and sweet, now felt cloying, suffocating her like a shroud. Amelia stumbled back, her wedding gown, pristine moments before, now crumpled and stained with the residue of spilled champagne, a tragic metaphor for her shattered dreams. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread barely audible above the murmuring whispers of the shocked guests. Her eyes, usually bright and warm, were clouded with disbelief, a storm brewing behind their glassy surface. Tears welled, then spilled over, tracing paths through the carefully applied makeup, blurring her vision. Julian, his face a mask of horror, tried to reach for her, but she flinched away as if he were a viper. The touch, intended as comfort, felt like a brand. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain, to somehow mend the gaping chasm that had opened between them, but no words came. His meticulously crafted world, built on lies and carefully cultivated illusions, was crumbling around him, leaving him paralyzed by a profound and agonizing sense of loss. Isabella, her own face pale and drawn, offered a shaky, pathetic attempt at an explanation. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice trembling. The weight of her revelation pressed down on her, heavier than the exquisite silk of her own dress. The opulent ballroom, a testament to Julian's wealth, felt like a gilded cage, trapping her in a web of guilt and regret. The champagne, once a symbol of celebration, now tasted like ash in her mouth. A strangled sob escaped Amelia's lips. She looked from Julian, his face etched with a grief that mirrored her own, to Isabella, her long-lost twin, a mirror image of herself yet a stranger in every crucial way. The shock was slowly giving way to a tidal wave of betrayal, a raw, visceral pain that threatened to consume her. The opulent setting, once a dream, now felt like an insult, a cruel reminder of the perfect life that had been stolen from her. The delicate music, previously a romantic soundtrack to her perfect day, now felt like a mocking soundtrack to her devastation. This wasn't a wedding anymore. It was a funeral for her future. The accusations hung in the air, sharp and jagged, like shards of broken glass. Amelia stared at Isabella, her twin, a stranger in a familiar face. The scent of lilies, once celebratory, now felt suffocating, a cruel reminder of the perfect illusion shattered. Tears streamed down Amelia's cheeks, hot and stinging, blurring the opulent ballroom into a hazy, distorted image. "How could you?" she whispered, the words laced with disbelief and a burgeoning rage that threatened to consume her. Isabella flinched, her own eyes brimming with unshed tears. The weight of her secret, the years of longing and misguided choices, pressed down on her, heavy as a leaden cloak. I didn't know," she repeated, her voice a fragile tremor. "I didn't know you were alive. I needed a family." Julian, his face etched with a mixture of horror and despair, tried to intervene. "Amelia, please," he began, but his voice was lost in the storm of Amelia's grief. He reached out, but she recoiled, the touch a betrayal of trust, a brand that burned. The champagne flutes, abandoned on the tables, seemed to mock the festive occasion that had devolved into chaos. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of Julian's carefully constructed world, now felt like a prison, its gilded cages trapping them in a suffocating web of lies and broken promises. The music, once a romantic melody, had faded, leaving only a chilling silence, punctuated by the sharp intake of breaths and the hushed whispers of the stunned guests. The diamond on Amelia's ring, a symbol of their impending future, felt heavy and cold against her skin, a cruel mockery of her shattered dreams. Each crystal chandelier seemed to weep with unshed tears, casting long, distorted shadows that mimicked the fractured pieces of their lives. The air, thick with unspoken emotions, crackled with tension, a silent scream trapped in the heart of the extravagant celebration. The festive scent of lilies transformed into a suffocating fragrance of betrayal and lost innocence. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the erratic thump of Julian's heart against his ribs. He watched, helpless, as Amelia stumbled back, her hand flying to her throat, as if to stifle the rising tide of her anguish. The pristine white of her wedding dress, once a symbol of purity, now seemed to amplify the starkness of her betrayal. The taste of champagne, celebratory moments ago, now turned bitter and acrid on his tongue. Isabella, pale and trembling, reached out a hand, a desperate plea for understanding lost in the maelstrom of Amelia's pain. Her carefully crafted composure crumbled, revealing the fragility beneath the veneer of confidence. The expensive silk of her dress, a vibrant contrast to Amelia's white, felt suddenly vulgar, a cruel reminder of the deception. I can explain," Isabella stammered, her voice barely audible above the hushed whispers of the stunned guests. The glittering ballroom, a spectacle of wealth and privilege just moments before, now felt cold and empty, a stark reflection of Julian's shattered world. The scent of lilies, heavy and cloying, seemed to mock the festive occasion. Amelia didn't respond, her gaze fixed on Isabella, a chilling mixture of shock and fury etched on her face. The diamond on her ring glittered, a cruel irony against the backdrop of her crumbling happiness. The weight of the revelation pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. Julian moved towards Amelia, his heart heavy with remorse, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical burden. He wanted to reach out to offer comfort, but fear held him back. The look in Amelia's eyes, a mixture of hurt, betrayal, and a chilling coldness, was a stark reminder of the damage he'd caused. "Amelia," he began, his voice a hoarse whisper, but she turned away, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The music, once a lively celebration, now echoed in his memory, a ghostly reminder of the perfect facade he'd so carefully constructed. His perfect life, his perfect wedding, his perfect fiancée, all shattered beyond repair. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him gasping for breath in the suffocating silence of the ballroom. The opulent surroundings, once a source of pride, now mocked him with their extravagance, a cruel reminder of the wealth that couldn't buy him happiness, couldn't buy him forgiveness. The DNA test, a small piece of paper, had detonated his meticulously crafted world, leaving behind only wreckage and despair. The weight of his actions, the shocking truth of Isabella's identity, the crushing betrayal of Amelia, all converged, threatening to bury him beneath the rubble of his own making. Amelia retreated, her wedding dress a pristine island in a sea of swirling chaos. The scent of lilies, once celebratory, now felt suffocating, clinging to the back of her throat like a bitter taste. Tears streamed down her face, blurring the opulent ballroom into a hazy watercolor. The champagne flutes, abandoned on nearby tables, seemed to mock her shattered joy. Julian reached out, his hand trembling, but she flinched away, the movement sharp and decisive. "Amelia, please," he pleaded, his voice raw with desperation. The weight of his deception pressed down on him, a physical burden he couldn't shake. She didn't answer, her silence a deafening condemnation. The diamond on her finger, once a symbol of her happiness, now felt like a cold, heavy weight, a stark reminder of his betrayal. The whispered conversations of the guests, a murmur of shocked disbelief, only amplified her isolation. Isabella, her face ashen, took a hesitant step forward. It's not what it seems," she whispered, her voice trembling. The vibrant silk of her dress seemed to dull, losing its luster under the weight of the revelation. The confidence she'd projected earlier was gone, replaced by a vulnerability that mirrored Amelia's own crushing despair. "What doesn't seem?" Amelia's voice, when she finally spoke, was brittle, laced with icy fury. Her gaze, fixed on Isabella, was unwavering, a silent challenge that hung heavy in the air. The glittering ballroom, once a symbol of their shared future, now seemed like a gilded cage, trapping them all in a web of deceit and shattered dreams. The heavy silence pressed down on them, broken only by the sporadic sniffles of Amelia and the frantic thump of Julian's heart. He knew explanations wouldn't suffice, not now. The damage was done. He traded a lifetime of happiness for a fleeting thrill, and the consequences were catastrophic. He watched, helpless, as Amelia turned and walked away, her slender form swallowed by the crowd of stunned and whispering guests. The faint scent of her perfume, a floral fragrance he once associated with joy, now carried a heavy note of sorrow, lingering in the air like a haunting melody. The weight of his actions bore down on him, a crushing burden that threatened to suffocate him within the gilded walls of his own creation. The opulent ballroom, once shimmering with joyous energy, now felt cold and vast, echoing with the silence of shattered dreams. Amelia's retreating figure, a wisp of white silk against the dark mahogany, left a void in the room, a palpable absence that Julian felt acutely. The scent of lilies, sharp and cloying, fought with the metallic tang of blood. A small cut on Amelia's hand, unnoticed amidst the chaos, now bled slowly onto the pristine white fabric of her dress. Isabella stood frozen, her beautiful gown suddenly heavy, the vibrant silk a cruel mockery of her inner turmoil. "Amelia," she whispered again, her voice cracking, the words caught in her throat, choked by a mixture of fear and regret. Julian, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him, felt the weight of his actions crush him. The champagne, once a symbol of celebration, now tasted like ash in his mouth. He reached for Amelia again, but this time, his movement was slower, more hesitant, born of desperation rather than entitlement. "I can explain," he began, his voice hoarse. Amelia stopped, her back to him, her shoulders shaking. The rhythmic sobs were barely audible over the hushed whispers of the remaining guests. "Explain what, Julian? Explain how you could betray me with her." The last word was spat out with venomous scorn, the name hanging heavy in the air like a poisoned dart. She turned, her eyes blazing with a fury that both terrified and captivated him. The diamond on her finger glinted, a cruel reminder of a promise broken beyond repair. The air crackled with unshed tears and unspoken accusations. Isabella, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, stepped closer. "It's not like that," she pleaded, her voice strained. There's something you don't know." She glanced at Julian, seeking support, finding only a man consumed by remorse. Amelia scoffed, her laughter devoid of humor. "Oh, is there? Is there some grand explanation for your affair? Some justification for the betrayal? Don't bother. I'm done." She turned, her resolve firm, leaving Julian and Isabella standing in the ruins of what was once his perfect wedding, a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of his choices. The lingering scent of lilies now mingled with the bitter taste of heartbreak, a potent cocktail of sorrow that clung to the opulent ballroom long after the guests had dispersed. The remnants of the lavish wedding feast lay scattered, discarded champagne flutes, half-eaten canapes, wilting roses strewn across the polished floor. A single, shattered wine glass mirrored the fragments of Julian's life. Amelia, her face pale and drawn, sat alone in a secluded alcove, the white of her dress stark against the dark tapestry. The diamond on her finger, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a cruel weight. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks, leaving tracks through the carefully applied makeup. The scent of lilies, once so intoxicating, now felt suffocating, a constant reminder of the shattered promise. Isabella, her own beauty dimmed by fear and regret, approached cautiously. "Amelia," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, let me explain." Amelia didn't look up. "Explain what? Explain how you stole him from me? How you could be so cruel?" Her voice, though choked with sobs, carried a steely edge, a fierce resentment that cut through the stunned silence of the room. The silence hung heavy, thick with unshed tears and unspoken accusations. The opulent ballroom, usually alive with laughter and music, felt claustrophobic, its gilded grandeur mocking their broken hearts. Julian watched, paralyzed, the weight of his deception pressing down on him. He longed to reach out to Amelia, to soothe her pain, but the words caught in his throat. His carefully constructed world had crumbled, revealing the shallow foundations upon which it was built. The intoxicating thrill of his affair with Isabella now felt like bitter ash in his mouth. The luxurious surroundings, once symbols of his success, now felt like a suffocating cage. He longed for the simple solace of honesty, a feeling he had long betrayed. Isabella, emboldened by desperation, continued, her voice trembling. "There's something you don't know about us. Something that might change everything." She fumbled in her bag, pulling out a worn photograph, a faded image of two little girls, identical smiles illuminating their faces. This is from before." Her voice trailed off, tears blurring her vision. The photograph, a fragile link to a lost past, landed on the marble table, a silent plea for understanding. The scent of old paper and faded ink hung in the air, a tangible connection to a hidden history. The weight of the unspoken truth pressed down, heavy and suffocating in the opulent yet desolate ballroom. The heavy silence in the ballroom was broken only by the rhythmic drip of a melting ice cube from an abandoned champagne flute. Amelia, her breathing shallow, clutched the silk of her dress, the fabric a stark contrast to the coldness she felt inside. Julian's whispered attempts at comfort were lost in the cavernous space, swallowed by the opulent but suddenly oppressive surroundings. The scent of lilies, now cloying and suffocating, filled her senses, a bitter reminder of the day's shattered promises. Isabella, her face etched with a mixture of fear and desperation, reached out a trembling hand. "Amelia," she started again, her voice catching, I have to tell you, there's something you need to know." Amelia, her eyes blazing with a mixture of hurt and anger, finally looked up. "I don't want to know anything from you," she spat, her voice low and dangerous. "I want to know why he chose you over me, after everything." The diamond on her finger, a cold, hard weight, seemed to mock her. She yanked it off, the sound echoing in the silence. It landed on the marble floor with a dull thud, mirroring the collapse of her dreams. The photograph lay between them, a faded image of two young girls, identical smiles frozen in time. Isabella's voice, when she spoke, was a fragile thing, barely audible above the faint thrum of the distant city. "That's us. Before the evacuation. We were separated. I didn't even know you existed until recently." Her voice cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks. Julian, watching the exchange, felt his carefully constructed world crumble further. The weight of his deception pressed down on him, suffocating him in the gilded cage of his own making. He had built this life on a foundation of lies and deceit, and now the consequences were shattering him. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of his success, felt like a prison. The champagne, the music, the laughter all felt hollow and meaningless, a cruel mockery of his shattered reality. He opened his mouth to speak, to try to explain, to somehow alleviate the pain, but no words came. He was left speechless, paralyzed by the weight of his actions and the unexpected truth that had shattered his perfect life. The luxurious setting mocked the devastation within his soul. The faded photograph, a relic from a forgotten past, lay between them, two identical little girls, beaming in matching sundresses. The city lights, blurred through the ballroom's tall windows, cast long shadows, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the oppressive silence. The scent of lilies, once a symbol of joyous celebration, now hung heavy and cloying, a suffocating reminder of shattered dreams. Isabella, her face streaked with tears, traced the outline of one of the girls with a trembling finger. "This was taken just before the fire," she whispered, her voice catching. "The hospital, they evacuated us. I was separated from my mother in the chaos. I remember bits and pieces. A bright red truck, a woman with kind eyes." Her voice trailed off, lost in the fragmented memories of a traumatic past. A sob escaped Amelia's lips, a raw, ragged sound that ripped through the stillness. The anger, so fierce moments before, seemed to ebb, replaced by a dawning comprehension, a slow, agonizing recognition. The similarities weren't just superficial. They ran deeper, resonating in the shared fragility of their gaze, the subtle curve of their identical smiles. Julian watched, his heart a lead weight in his chest. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of his carefully constructed success, now felt like a suffocating tomb. The champagne flutes, still half-filled, mocked the emptiness that gnawed at his soul. He had built a life on a foundation of lies, and the tremors from its collapse were devastating. I never knew," Amelia finally said, her voice barely a whisper. The words hung in the air, heavy with a lifetime of unspoken longing and loss. The diamond ring, lying cold and discarded on the marble floor, seemed to symbolize the coldness that had settled in her heart. The coldness that had been there all along, a subtle undercurrent masked by a forced optimism. It wasn't just Julian's betrayal she grappled with. It was a lifetime of longing for a connection she never knew existed. The lost years, the unspoken questions, the ache of a missing piece of herself, all coalesced in that single, heartbroken whisper. The weight of the unspoken, the trauma of separation, hung palpable in the air. The photograph, a silent testament to their shared history, was more than just a picture. It was a key, unlocking a door to a past neither knew existed. The truth, unveiled amidst the wreckage of a ruined wedding, offered a bittersweet possibility of a future she could never have imagined. The opulent ballroom, now eerily silent save for the faint ticking of a grandfather clock, felt colder than the discarded champagne flutes. Amelia, her face pale and drawn, stared at the photograph, the twin girls' smiles a cruel mockery of her current despair. The lilies, their scent now cloying and suffocating, seemed to mirror the suffocating weight of her betrayal. She traced the outline of one of the girls, a mirror image of herself, a chilling echo of a life she never knew. "It explains so much," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the silence. The anger, the raw, burning rage, had begun to recede, replaced by a tidal wave of confusion and a nascent curiosity. Isabella, her own eyes red-rimmed, reached out a hesitant hand. I'm so sorry, Amelia," she choked out, her voice thick with unshed tears. The guilt was etched onto her face, a stark contrast to the alluring confidence she had displayed just hours before. Julian, watching the exchange with a heart heavy with regret, felt the weight of his actions crushing him. He had built his life on lies, a meticulously crafted facade that had crumbled under the weight of the truth. He wanted to speak, to offer some solace, some explanation, but the words caught in his throat. His carefully constructed world had imploded, leaving him adrift in a sea of his own making. The faint scent of Amelia's perfume, a delicate floral blend, mingled with the heavy scent of lilies, creating a strange, unsettling olfactory dissonance. The opulent chandeliers seemed to mock the shattered fragments of their lives, their glittering light casting stark shadows that underscored the depth of their despair. The marble floor, cold beneath Amelia's bare feet, reflected the icy chill settling in her heart. Amelia finally looked up, her gaze locking with Isabella's. The anger was gone, replaced by something akin to understanding. A shared vulnerability resonated between them, a silent acknowledgement of a past that had been cruelly severed, a bond forged in a crucible of trauma and loss. "The red truck," Amelia whispered, a flicker of memory igniting in her eyes. I think I remember it too. A flash of red, a blur of faces." Isabella nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Me too. And a woman, singing a lullaby. It's all so fragmented, so..." She trailed off, overwhelmed by the torrent of emotions threatening to consume her. The shared memories, however fractured, created a bridge between them, a fragile connection spanning the chasm of years and heartbreak. The weight of the past hung heavy in the air, but amidst the wreckage, a glimmer of hope, a possibility of healing, began to emerge. The shattered pieces of their lives, scattered across the marble floor of the opulent ballroom, held the potential to be pieced back together, forming a new, unexpected, and undeniably complex family. The old hospital records, brittle with age, detailed the chaotic evacuation. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight slicing through the grimy window of the archive room. Amelia traced a faded finger across a photograph, two identical babies, swaddled in identical blankets, their tiny fists clenched. A wave of dizziness washed over her. "They look just like us," Isabella whispered, her voice barely a breath. The shared trauma pulsed between them, a silent understanding in the midst of the overwhelming grief and confusion. The faded ink described the frenzied rush, the screaming sirens, the desperate scramble to save lives. A mix-up, a lost tag, a hurried decision. Then, silence. Years of silence. "A red truck," Amelia murmured, the memory surfacing, hazy and indistinct. "I remember a flash of red." Isabella nodded, tears blurring her vision. "Me too." And a lullaby, a woman singing. It was all so fragmented. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched Amelia's. The touch sparked a connection, a recognition that transcended words. It was a silent acknowledgement of shared loss, a fragile bridge built across a chasm of time and separation. The archive room, normally sterile and impersonal, felt charged with emotion. The scent of old paper and dust clung to the air, a tangible reminder of the past's enduring presence. The weight of their shared history settled upon them, a heavy blanket woven from sorrow and a tentative hope. Outside, the sun continued its journey across the sky, oblivious to the seismic shifts occurring within the small, dusty room. The discovery, however incomplete, was a turning point. It offered a glimmer of understanding, a potential path towards healing, and a first step toward a future they never imagined. The pieces of their shattered past, like the fragmented memories of the red truck and the lullaby, held the promise of being pieced back together, forming a new, unexpected, and deeply complex family dynamic. The sterile scent of antiseptic still clung to Amelia's clothes, a phantom smell from the hospital archive. She sat in the opulent, yet suddenly cold, drawing room of Julian's mansion, the discarded DNA report lying crumpled on the polished mahogany coffee table like a discarded life. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the golden light, a stark contrast to the carefully orchestrated perfection of the wedding that had been. "A red truck?" Amelia repeated, her voice a fragile whisper, lost in the vastness of the room. The memory, so faint yet so vivid, felt both real and surreal. It was a detail, a shard of glass in the wreckage of her childhood, a piece of a puzzle she never knew existed. Isabella, sitting opposite, her usually vibrant eyes dulled with a mixture of grief and dawning understanding, reached for a silver photo frame sitting on a side table. Inside, a faded photograph showed two babies, identical in every feature except the tiny bows adorning their heads. One pink, one blue. "My mother always kept this hidden," Isabella murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "She never spoke about the other one." She traced the outline of the baby's face, her fingertip lingering on the delicate curve of a cheek. Amelia's gaze lingered on the photo, a mirror image of her own life, yet a life she had never known. A life shared with this stranger, this sister. The weight of the revelation settled heavily on her chest, a suffocating blanket of disbelief and pain. She sang a lullaby," Amelia said, the words barely audible. "A lullaby. I remember fragments." The silence stretched, filled only with the soft ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a hammer blow against Amelia's fragile composure. The shared memory, the shared trauma, was a silent bridge building between them, a connection forged in the crucible of loss and separation. The shared grief was palpable, hanging heavy in the air like the scent of lilies that still lingered from the ruined wedding. The opulent setting felt suddenly irrelevant, insignificant in the face of this staggering revelation, this unexpected familial bond forged in the ashes of her shattered trust in Julian. The next steps, the reconciliation, the forgiveness, all felt impossibly far away, lost somewhere in the echoing silence of the grand room. Yet, in the shared look of recognition, a glimmer of something new and hopeful flickered. The The heavy oak door creaked shut behind Amelia, leaving her alone with Isabella in the cool, dimly lit library. Sunlight, fractured by stained glass windows, painted the room in shifting hues of ruby and emerald. The air, thick with the scent of old leather and dust, felt heavy with unspoken accusations. Amelia, her face pale and drawn, ran a hand through her disheveled hair. She picked up a discarded velvet cushion, its plush softness offering little comfort. "So," Amelia began, her voice barely a whisper, "you're my sister." The words hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. She didn't shout, didn't rage. The shock had left her drained, replaced by a chilling emptiness. Isabella nodded, her gaze fixed on the intricately carved wooden bookshelf. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I didn't know you existed, until now." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail through her carefully applied makeup. Amelia studied her, searching for a trace of the alluring woman who had stolen her fiancé. But all she saw was vulnerability, a mirror image of the insecurity that had always lurked beneath her own confident exterior. The shared trauma, the long separation, forged a strange, unexpected kinship. He knew," Amelia finally managed, the words a low growl in her throat. The hurt, sharp and searing, was a constant ache. "He knew all along." Isabella flinched. I didn't mean to hurt you," she said, her voice trembling. I wanted a family, a life." Her eyes, usually sparkling with mischief, were clouded with regret. Amelia looked away, unable to meet Isabella's gaze. The weight of betrayal, the shattering of her perfect life, threatened to crush her. Yet, in the silence that followed, something shifted. A flicker of recognition, a shared understanding of loss and abandonment, bridged the chasm between them. The opulent library, with its symbols of Julian's wealth, faded into the background as the two women, connected by fate and a shared past, found themselves facing the wreckage of their lives together. The anger remained, but now it shared space with a dawning sense of shared grief, a shared understanding of a life lived in the shadow of a missing twin. The library's heavy silence pressed in on them, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. Amelia, still reeling from the revelation, felt a tremor run through her, a physical manifestation of the emotional earthquake that had shattered her world. The scent of old paper and polished wood did little to soothe her raw nerves. She picked up a framed photograph, a faded image of two young girls, identical smiles frozen in time. One was undeniably her, the other Isabella. The shared likeness was uncanny, yet the subtle differences in their expressions hinted at divergent paths. "He said he loved me," Amelia whispered, the words catching in her throat. The accusation wasn't directed at Isabella, but at the ghost of Julian's betrayal. Isabella's shoulders slumped. "I know," she breathed, her voice thick with remorse. The carefully constructed facade of self-assurance had crumbled, revealing a vulnerable core. I never intended to hurt you. I was so lost, so alone." She traced the outline of a chipped teacup on the nearby table, her fingers trembling slightly. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden light. Amelia stared at the photograph, the two girls' smiling faces a stark contrast to the turmoil in her own heart. The anger, initially a consuming fire, was slowly being replaced by a cold, numb ache. A shared sense of loss, a recognition of a past stolen from them both, began to bloom between them. "Alone," Amelia repeated, her gaze shifting to Isabella. "We were both alone, but we were alone together, weren't we? For all those years, we were missing a piece of ourselves." The realization struck her with a force that momentarily eclipsed the pain. The shared history, the unspoken connection, began to emerge from the shadows of their separate lives, a fragile thread of kinship weaving its way through the wreckage of betrayal. Isabella looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. A faint smile touched her lips. "Yes," she agreed softly. I think we were." The unspoken words hung heavy in the air, a shared acknowledgement of a sisterhood born of loss and unexpected reunion. The air, once thick with accusations, now held the faintest glimmer of understanding, a shared sorrow forging a bond stronger than the pain. The path ahead remained uncertain, shrouded in uncertainty and the lingering wounds of betrayal. Yet, in this moment of shared vulnerability, a fragile hope began to take root, a possibility of healing and perhaps even forgiveness. The opulent suite felt suffocating, the gilded cage of Julian's wealth mocking Amelia's shattered spirit. Sunlight, usually a source of comfort, now felt harsh, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the suffocating stillness. The scent of lilies, once associated with wedding bliss, now clung to the air like a cloying reminder of her betrayal. Amelia sat rigid on the plush chaise lounge, the silk sinking beneath her weight, offering no solace. Isabella, perched on the edge of a velvet armchair, nervously twisted a silver napkin. The vibrant gown she'd worn to the wedding now seemed a grotesque costume, its shimmering fabric a painful counterpoint to her own inner turmoil. I didn't know," Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible above the faint hum of the air conditioning. Her eyes, the same startling blue as Amelia's, were filled with a mixture of fear and regret. "About Julian, about you. I only learned about Amelia, about us, just days before the wedding." Amelia's gaze remained fixed on the untouched champagne flute on the table before her. The bubbles, once a symbol of celebration, now felt like a bitter mockery. "Days?" she repeated, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. The anger, initially a raging inferno, had been replaced by a chilling emptiness. "The DNA test. It was a desperate attempt to find my family," Isabella explained, her voice cracking. "After years of searching, of feeling lost." She paused, her breath hitching. Finding you was like a miracle." And then, her voice trailed off, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. A bitter laugh escaped Amelia's lips. "A miracle? You arrived, a whirlwind of passion and deceit, and stole my fiancé, my future. And now you're telling me it was a miracle?" Isabella flinched, her shoulders slumping. "No, I never meant to." She looked around the luxurious suite, her eyes suddenly registering the extravagance, the stark contrast to her own modest past. "I was so blinded by the opportunity, by the glamour, I didn't think." Silence descended again, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the distant murmur of city life filtering through the soundproof windows. The weight of the shared past, a past neither fully remembered, but acutely felt, settled between them like a suffocating blanket. The room, despite its opulence, felt stark and bare, mirroring the emotional landscape Amelia navigated. The path to understanding, to forgiveness, remained long and arduous, fraught with the echoes of betrayal and the weight of a life-altering secret. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hall. Amelia finally spoke, her voice a low tremor. "So you knew all along about me." The accusation hung heavy in the air, tinged with the bitter taste of betrayal. Isabella flinched, her gaze dropping to her hands, now clasped tightly together. The opulent suite, with its shimmering silks and crystal chandeliers, felt like a cruel mockery of her present turmoil. I didn't know," Isabella whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "Not until the test results. I saw a photograph, a faded picture of a baby girl, identical to me, a name scrawled on the back. Amelia." Tears welled in her eyes, mirroring the storm raging inside Amelia. The shared blue of their eyes, now brimming with unshed tears, seemed to highlight the cruel irony of their situation. Amelia stood, her movements stiff and deliberate. She walked to the vast window overlooking the city, the glittering expanse offering no solace. The city lights blurred through her tears. The cold glass felt strangely comforting against her cheek. "And what did you do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, each word sharp with pain. "You pursued Julian She didn't need to finish the sentence. The unspoken words hung heavy between them. Isabella stood as well, her own movements hesitant, as if afraid to disturb the delicate balance of their shared grief. "I was desperate," she said, her voice trembling. "Lonely. I had spent my whole life searching for my family. A family I didn't even know existed. When I found Julian, it was like a life raft in a storm." She paused, her voice cracking. The scent of lilies from the wedding, still lingering in the air, felt like a suffocating perfume. A wave of nausea washed over Amelia. The cold glass felt clammy against her skin. The luxurious setting, once a dream, now felt like a prison. The truth unveiled was raw and brutal. "And you didn't think of me? Of the woman you were stealing the life from?" She turned, her face etched with a sorrow that transcended mere anger. The resemblance, the striking familial likeness between them, only amplified the depth of the betrayal. The shared trauma, only just revealed, hung between them, a heavy, invisible chain. The path ahead was uncertain, a treacherous journey through the wreckage of shattered dreams and unexpected truths. Julian found Amelia in the deserted bridal suite, the remnants of the lavish wedding a stark contrast to her quiet despair. The scent of lilies, once celebratory, now hung heavy, a cloying reminder of the shattered promises. He approached cautiously, the silence amplifying the weight of his actions. Sunlight slanted through the gap in the curtains, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a microscopic ballet of sorrow. "Amelia," he began, his voice a low rumble, barely audible above the pounding of his own heart. He saw the tremor in her shoulders, the way her hands were clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. She didn't turn. "Don't," she whispered, her voice choked with unshed tears. "Don't try to explain. There's nothing you can say." He knelt beside her, the plush carpet yielding beneath his knees. The opulent surroundings felt alien, jarring against the raw vulnerability etched on her face. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers, then retracting as if burned. "I know I hurt you," he said, his voice thick with remorse. "But I never meant to." "Meant to what, Julian?" She finally turned, her eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. The resemblance to Isabella was striking, a painful reminder of the tangled web he had woven. "Meant to destroy everything? Meant to betray my trust in the most devastating way imaginable." He swallowed, the lump in his throat making speech difficult. "I fell in love with Isabella," he admitted, his voice barely a breath. "But that doesn't excuse anything. It doesn't explain the pain I've caused." Amelia rose, her movements stiff and controlled. She walked to the window, her back to him, the city sprawling beneath them, a dizzying panorama of lights and shadows. "And now," she said, her voice low and trembling, "I find out she's my twin sister, that you slept with my twin, knowing, while I trusted you utterly." A sob escaped, a single, heartbreaking sound in the vast, silent room. The weight of betrayal, compounded by the shocking revelation, was almost unbearable. Julian felt the crushing weight of his actions, the unexpected familial connection twisting a knife into his already wounded heart. He had destroyed everything, not just his engagement but possibly the nascent relationship between two long-lost sisters. The luxury that surrounded them felt mocking, a cruel irony against the devastation within. He had to repair this, he had to find a way. But how? The path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, a treacherous journey through the wreckage of his own making. The hospital records, brittle with age, detailed the chaotic evacuation. Amelia traced a faded photograph of a tiny, swaddled infant, her own reflection staring back, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. Beside it, another baby, almost identical, a mirror image, but with a slightly different tilt to the head. A chilling wave of understanding washed over her, a shared past, a stolen future. The scent of antiseptic, faintly lingering on the aged paper, brought a rush of phantom memories. A shared crib, perhaps? A shared lullaby? Isabella sat opposite, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes mirroring Amelia's own shock and disbelief. I never knew," she whispered, her voice trembling. The shared trauma, the years of separate lives, hung heavy in the air, a palpable silence broken only by the soft tick of a clock on the wall. The sterile white of the hospital room felt less clinical, more like a battlefield where a family had been ripped apart. "It wasn't my fault," Isabella continued, her voice catching. "I was so young, I only remember fragments. A woman's face, kind but hurried. The screaming, the confusion. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks, tracing paths through the carefully applied makeup. Amelia reached out, her fingers brushing Isabella's hand. The touch was tentative, hesitant, yet filled with an unexpected empathy. The anger that had consumed her earlier was replaced by a strange mix of pity and a growing sense of kinship. "It wasn't yours or mine," Amelia said softly, her own voice thick with emotion. "It was fate, cruel fate." The shared gaze held a silent understanding, a recognition of shared loss, a bond forged in the crucible of a long-lost past. The weight of their separate lives, the accidental paths that had led them to this moment, felt less like a betrayal and more like a heartbreaking twist of destiny. The air crackled with unspoken questions, unresolved grief, and a tentative hope for connection. The future remained uncertain, but the first step towards healing had been taken, a fragile bridge built across the chasm of years. The scent of lilies from Julian's wedding, the opulent rooms, the betrayal, faded into the background, replaced by a deeper, more profound connection between the long-lost sisters. Julian paced the opulent hotel suite, the plush carpet muffling the frantic rhythm of his footsteps. The scent of lilies, a constant reminder of the wedding that had imploded, clung to the air, heavy and cloying. He ran a hand through his hair, the exhaustion etched deep into his face. Amelia's silence, heavier than any scream, was a constant pressure. He tried to explain, to apologize, but his words had fallen flat against the wall of her hurt. He picked up a discarded wedding photograph, Amelia's radiant smile a painful mockery of his current despair. The image of Isabella, her own face etched with a mixture of remorse and hope, flashed before his eyes. He felt the crushing weight of his actions, the unforeseen consequences of his choices. This wasn't just about a broken engagement. It was about shattered lives, a family torn apart, then unexpectedly reunited in the most devastating way. A knock on the door broke the suffocating silence. He braced himself, opening the door to reveal Amelia, her eyes red-rimmed, her composure fragile. I need some air," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the pounding of his own heart. They walked in silence to the hotel terrace, the cool night air a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the suite. The city, lights twinkled below, a glittering indifference to their turmoil. Amelia leaned against the railing, her shoulders slumped, her body trembling slightly. It's not fair," she finally breathed, her voice cracking. I thought I knew you." Julian's heart ached. He knew his words wouldn't erase the pain, but he had to try. "Amelia, I can't explain it away. What I did was wrong. But please, let me try to make things right." He reached for her hand, his touch tentative, filled with regret. She didn't pull away. I found our baby picture," she continued, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze fixed on the distant lights. 2 babies, identical twins. She turned to him, her eyes filled with a heartbreaking mixture of grief and understanding. "And you knew Isabella all along." The unshed tears glistened on her cheeks. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken emotions. The weight of his betrayal, compounded by the revelation of the twins, hung heavy in the night air. The city lights seemed to dim, their brilliance dulled by the storm raging within them. The hotel terrace offered little solace. The city lights, a million shimmering pinpricks, felt mockingly distant from their intimate turmoil. Amelia's quiet sobs punctuated the night's hum. Julian watched her, the sharp scent of jasmine from the nearby bushes doing little to mask the bitter tang of his regret. He reached for her hand again, his touch hesitant, a plea for forgiveness etched in the gesture. This time, she didn't pull away. "It's not just the affair, Julian," she whispered, her voice raw with pain. "It's the lies, the deception." Everything felt calculated. She shivered, pulling her thin silk shawl tighter around her shoulders. The night air, once a welcome respite, now felt chillingly sharp. "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "There's no excuse. I was a fool, blinded by everything. But Isabella..." He hesitated, searching for the right words, the right way to explain the impossible twist of fate that had brought them to this precipice. "Isabella?" Amelia repeated, the name a bitter taste on her tongue. "My twin sister. And you knew." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the city lights, a storm brewing within their depths. "How could you?" The question hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Julian wanted to explain the intoxicating pull of Isabella, the unexpected connection that had blossomed amidst the chaos of his carefully constructed life. But the words caught in his throat. How could he justify his actions, explain the tangled web of betrayal and unforeseen familial bonds? He pulled her closer, the silk of her dress cool against his skin. "I was selfish, Amelia, terribly selfish. I'm so sorry." He pressed a kiss to her forehead, a silent apology for the pain he had inflicted. The touch seemed to break through a dam of emotion. Amelia leaned into him, the fragility of her composure evident in the trembling of her body. The silence that followed was different this time, less burdened by accusations, more filled with a shared grief. The city lights continued their silent vigil, witnesses to the unfolding drama of a love story irrevocably altered, yet perhaps not entirely lost. A glimmer of hope, fragile as a newborn's breath, flickered in the darkness between them. The journey to forgiveness was long and arduous, but in the quiet intimacy of that shared moment, a first step was taken. The sterile scent of antiseptic still clung to Isabella's memory, a phantom smell from the hospital where she'd woken, alone, after the evacuation. She stared out the window of her expensive hotel suite, the city sprawling beneath her like a glittering, indifferent beast. Guilt gnawed at her, a relentless ache mirroring the phantom pain in her abandoned childhood. Amelia's face, a mirror image overlaid with a lifetime of different experiences, haunted her. The shared memories, unearthed by the DNA test, the identical birthmarks, the faint scar on their left wrists, were a constant reminder of what she'd lost, and what she'd gained in the most terrible way. She picked up a framed photograph, a faded image of two little girls, identical smiles playing on their lips. The resemblance was uncanny. It was her and Amelia, younger versions of themselves, oblivious to the cruel twist of fate that would separate them. The image brought tears, hot and stinging. They could have been inseparable, growing up together, sharing secrets whispered in darkened bedrooms. And now, this bitter, twisted reunion. A wave of self-loathing washed over her. She'd sought Julian, a way to fill the gaping hole in her life, the desperate need for belonging that had been her constant companion. She hadn't intended to hurt Amelia, but her actions had done just that, and the realization was a crushing weight on her chest. The luxury surrounding her felt suffocating, a cruel irony given the emptiness inside. She was a millionaire's mistress, a role that offered nothing but fleeting pleasure, a hollow substitute for the genuine connection she craved. The phone rang, shrill and jarring. She flinched, then answered. It was Julian. His voice, usually smooth and confident, was strained, fragile. "Isabella," he said, the single word heavy with unshed tears. "I need to see you. Amelia, she's hurting so much. I don't know what to do." The phone line crackled with static, a symbolic representation of the fractured pieces of their lives. Isabella's own pain mingled with the sharp edge of sympathy. She saw in Julian's desperation a reflection of her own loneliness, a shared wound opened up by the brutal revelations of the last 24 hours. "I'll come," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. The city lights flickered, mirroring the uncertain hope that flickered in her heart. The path to redemption was unclear, fraught with obstacles and unforgivable mistakes. But perhaps, just perhaps, she could help mend the shattered pieces of this unexpected family. The mahogany table in Amelia's secluded study felt cold beneath her fingertips. Sunlight, filtered through dusty rose curtains, cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the swirling dust motes dancing in the silence. The scent of lilies, her favorite, now felt cloying, a bitter reminder of the opulent wedding that had imploded. Julian's attempts at contact, frantic texts, desperate phone calls lay unanswered. Her phone, face down, vibrated with another silent message. She didn't need to see it. She knew the tone, pleading, apologetic. It did nothing to quell the icy rage that still burned in her veins. A soft knock echoed through the quiet room. Hesitantly, she called, "Come in." Isabella entered, her usually vibrant clothes muted in shades of gray. Her eyes, usually sparkling with mischief, were shadowed with a weariness that mirrored Amelia's own. The shared DNA, the shared trauma, had forged an unexpected kinship, but it was overshadowed by the monumental betrayal. "Amelia," Isabella began, her voice barely a whisper. I need to talk to you." Amelia didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the intricate Persian rug beneath her feet. The rich textures felt insignificant compared to the frayed edges of her own shattered life. Isabella continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I know saying sorry isn't enough, and never will be, but I want you to understand. The evacuation, losing you, it scarred me. I spent my whole life searching for a connection, something real. I never meant to hurt you." A long silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the hallway. The silence held the weight of years of unspoken pain, shared history, and irreparable damage. Finally, Amelia spoke, her voice low and even chillingly calm. "You took something precious from me, Isabella. You stole my future, my happiness, my trust." Isabella flinched, the carefully constructed composure cracking. Tears welled up in her eyes, reflecting the same pain and regret that mirrored Amelia's own agony. The shared past, now laid bare, was a double-edged sword, causing both pain and a tentative understanding. The weight of their shared history hung heavily in the air, a tangible presence that even the sunlight couldn't dispel. The path to forgiveness, if there was one, remained shrouded in a dense fog of betrayal and heartache. The scent of old paper and dust clung to the air in the attic, a stark contrast to the opulent perfume that had filled Julian's mansion just days before. Amelia traced a faded photograph, her fingers lingering on the image of two smiling toddlers, identical except for the tiny birthmark on one's cheek. This was the only tangible proof of Isabella's existence, a ghost from a forgotten past. "Do you remember this?" she whispered, the question hanging in the air between them. Isabella, perched on a dusty trunk, nodded slowly, her eyes welling. The shared memory, a fleeting glimpse of a childhood stolen by fate, sparked a fragile connection between them. The weight of their shared history, once a source of anger, began to transform, revealing a kinship as potent as their betrayal. The hospital, the chaos. Isabella's voice cracked, her words catching in her throat. The attic's hushed stillness amplified the emotional tremor in her voice. The memory of the evacuation, a night of screaming sirens and panicked parents, was a shared nightmare. Amelia leaned against a crumbling wall, the rough plaster scratching against her skin, mirroring the raw edges of her emotions. "I remember the cold," she breathed, a shiver passing through her despite the summer heat outside. "The fear, the separation, the shared trauma, unexpectedly, forged a connection stronger than the resentment." The rage that had consumed Amelia began to ebb, replaced by a confusing mixture of pity and a nascent understanding of Isabella's desperate actions. Isabella reached out, her hand trembling slightly, touching Amelia's arm. The contact sparked a jolt, a sudden awareness of the deep bond that transcended the betrayal. This was not just a rival for Julian's affection. This was a kindred spirit, a lost piece of herself. "I never wanted to hurt you," Isabella repeated, her voice raw with sincerity. I wanted a family." Her confession hung heavy in the air, laced with a profound loneliness that resonated with Amelia's own feelings of abandonment. The silence that followed was not one of animosity, but a quiet recognition of shared pain. The dust motes in the sunbeams seemed to dance with a newfound hope. The path to forgiveness wasn't clear, but in that dusty attic, under the weight of their shared past, a seed of understanding had finally been planted. The mahogany door to Julian's study felt heavy in Amelia's hand, a physical manifestation of the weight on her heart. Sunlight slanted through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stillness. The air, usually thick with the scent of expensive cigars, held only the faint, lingering fragrance of lilies, a ghostly reminder of the wedding that never was. Julian sat hunched over his desk, the expensive leather creaking softly beneath his weight. His shoulders were slumped, a stark contrast to his usual impeccable posture. "Amelia," he began, his voice a low murmur, barely audible above the ticking of an antique grandfather clock. I don't know what to say." She met his gaze, her own eyes reflecting the turmoil within. "You could start with the truth," she replied, her voice tight with unshed tears. The truth, she knew, was a tangled web of deceit, passion, and a shocking familial revelation, a truth that had shattered her world. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the gesture revealing the depth of his despair. "I was a fool, Amelia, a selfish, reckless fool." He paused, searching for the right words, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I loved you, I do love you, but Isabella." The name hung in the air, a bitter taste on Amelia's tongue. She closed her eyes, trying to conjure the image of her fiancé, the man she thought she knew, and the cruel deception that had been woven around her. The image of Isabella, her stunning beauty a stark contrast to the raw pain in her eyes, also surfaced. Could this really be her twin sister? "She's different," Amelia finally whispered, more to herself than to Julian. "Stronger, more bold." She hesitated, the words catching in her throat. "She's not you." The accusation, unintended, hung heavy in the silence. Julian nodded, his expression a mixture of guilt and a dawning recognition. "She's been searching for you all her life, Amelia. She felt like a ghost, an orphan. Finding me, finding you, it was her way of finding a family." His voice cracked. He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant, yet desperate for connection. The warmth of his touch battled against the icy chill of her betrayal. The question of forgiveness remained, a daunting task suspended between them in the silent study, bathed in the golden light of a devastating revelation. The future, once so bright, now shimmered with uncertainty. The days bled into one another, a blurry tapestry woven with grief and disbelief. Amelia retreated to the secluded beach house her grandmother had left her, the rhythmic crash of waves a constant, mournful counterpoint to the turmoil within. Salt spray kissed her face, mirroring the tears that often streamed unchecked down her cheeks. The scent of brine and seaweed, usually soothing, now felt as sharp and raw as the wound in her heart. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, a knock echoed through the quiet house. It was Isabella. She stood on the porch, silhouetted against the dying light, a figure both familiar and alien. Amelia hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle. The sight of Isabella, so strikingly similar yet so utterly different from Amelia herself, stirred a potent cocktail of emotions: anger, confusion, a nascent flicker of something akin to curiosity. "Amelia," Isabella began, her voice soft, hesitant. I didn't know how else to reach you." Amelia opened the door, the hinges groaning like a sigh. "What do you want, Isabella?" Her voice was flat, devoid of warmth. Isabella stepped inside, the scent of sea air clinging to her like a shroud. "I wanted to apologize. For everything. For intruding on your life. For hurting you." She wrung her hands, her usual self-assuredness replaced by a vulnerability that mirrored Amelia's own. The soft lamplight illuminated the tremor in her hands. Amelia studied her, searching for any hint of malice, of the manipulative woman she had glimpsed at the ruined wedding. She saw only a deep sadness, a haunted quality in her eyes. The shared genetics were undeniable, yet their life experiences had carved drastically different paths. "It's not enough to apologize," Amelia said, her voice still laced with ice. "You stole my fiancé, my future." "I know," Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible, "and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends. But I want to understand, to know what it's like to have a sister, a family." Tears welled in her eyes, and this time, they weren't the calculated tears of manipulation. These were raw, honest, born of genuine remorse and a desperate longing for connection. The sound of the waves continued, a relentless pulse against the silence. Amelia felt a strange shift within her, a cracking in the icy fortress she had built around her heart. The anger was still there, but beneath it, a flicker of something else, pity, perhaps, or a tentative curiosity about the life of this woman who was both a stranger and a reflection of herself. The weight of the betrayal remained, but so did the seed of an unexpected possibility. The possibility of a sister. The salt-laced wind whipped Amelia's hair across her face as she stared out at the turbulent ocean. The relentless gray mirrored the storm raging inside her. Isabella's words, raw and laced with genuine remorse, echoed in her mind. A sister. The idea was both horrifying and strangely compelling. Days turned into weeks, each sunrise a fresh wave of grief. Yet something had shifted. The ice around her heart, while still thick, showed hairline fractures. One afternoon, sunlight filtering through the rain-streaked windows, Amelia found herself picking up a faded photograph. It showed two toddlers, identical smiles illuminating their faces, nestled in a worn wicker basket. A pang of something akin to longing pierced the numbness. It was a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge until now. The next day, Amelia found herself at the small, local cafe Isabella frequented. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baking bread hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the desolate scent of the sea. Isabella was there, looking smaller, more vulnerable than Amelia remembered. "Amelia," Isabella whispered, her voice trembling. She pushed a worn, leather-bound journal across the small table. I found this among my mother's things. It's about our past." Amelia hesitated, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the journal. The weight of shared history pressed down on her, a tangible link to the woman sitting across from her. Opening the journal, she saw neat, spidery handwriting detailing a life she never knew existed, a life shared, a life cruelly ripped apart. Tears welled, blurring the ink, but this time they felt different. They were tears of sorrow, yes, but also tears of recognition, of a burgeoning connection she'd fought so hard to deny. The ocean's rage had subsided, replaced by a fragile, hesitant calm. The path ahead was still unclear, fraught with pain and uncertainty. But for the first time since the wedding, Amelia felt a glimmer of hope, a faint warmth breaking through the icy grip of betrayal. The possibility of a sister, a family, however fractured, was no longer a terrifying concept, but a fragile seed of healing. The therapist's office smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. Amelia traced the rim of her chipped teacup, the floral pattern a stark contrast to the turmoil inside her. The ocean's relentless roar, a constant companion these past weeks, felt muted here, replaced by the hushed ticking of a grandfather clock. Dr. Anya Sharma, a woman whose calm demeanor belied a sharp intellect, watched patiently. "It's overwhelming," Amelia finally said, her voice a fragile whisper. "The betrayal, the sister. It's all too much." Dr. Sharma nodded gently. "It's understandable. You've experienced a profound loss and a shocking revelation simultaneously. Allow yourself to feel the full weight of it." Amelia squeezed her eyes shut. The memory of Julian's anguished face, the raw confusion in Isabella's eyes, flashed before her. The opulent wedding hall transformed into a scene of shattered dreams. The exquisite cake, untouched, a symbol of her ruined future. "I keep replaying it," she confessed, her voice cracking, searching for a sign, a clue I missed. But there was nothing. He was so convincing. Self-deception is often a powerful force, Dr. Sharma observed. It allowed you to overlook subtle signs, perhaps insecurities within your own relationship. Focusing on those insecurities now can help you rebuild stronger, healthier relationships in the future. Amelia considered this a slow, painful understanding dawning. Julian's charm, his wealth, had blinded her to her own needs, to her own doubts. His constant assurances of love had masked a deeper, more insidious betrayal. It wasn't just the affair. It was the erosion of trust, the subtle neglect that had laid the foundation for Isabella's intrusion. A tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. "I feel so foolish," she murmured. "Foolishness is a human trait, not a character flaw," Dr. Sharma countered softly. "Learning from this experience is what matters. Understanding the dynamics that led to this situation, and how you can navigate future relationships with greater self-awareness." Amelia wiped her eyes, a new resolve hardening her gaze. The grief remained, a heavy cloak she couldn't yet shed, but beneath it, a flicker of something stronger ignited, a spark of self-discovery, a determination to rebuild, not just her life, but herself. The path to forgiveness, to healing, was long and arduous, but she was beginning to see it, a path she would walk one tentative step at a time. The ocean breeze, salty and sharp, whipped Amelia's hair across her face as she walked the beach. The rhythmic crash of waves against the shore was a counterpoint to the tempest raging within her. Days blurred into weeks, each sunrise a fresh wave of grief, each sunset a reminder of the life she'd lost. The opulent wedding, the glittering reception, now felt like a cruel, elaborate dream. She picked up a smooth, gray stone, its coolness a stark contrast to the burning heat of her anger. "How could he?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sea's roar. The question echoed the countless others that haunted her. How could Julian have kept such a profound secret? How could Isabella have played such a callous role? And most agonizingly, how could she, Amelia, have been so blind? That night, curled on her sofa, the plush velvet doing little to soothe her aching heart, her phone buzzed. It was Isabella. Amelia hesitated, her finger hovering over the screen. The thought of speaking to her sister, the woman who had stolen her fiancé, felt like swallowing shards of glass. Yet, a sliver of curiosity, a desperate hope for some semblance of understanding, pushed her to answer. "Amelia," Isabella's voice, hesitant and filled with a weariness that mirrored her own, crackled through the speaker. I know I hurt you terribly. There's no excuse for my actions. But I need you to understand." Silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the distant wail of a siren. Amelia closed her eyes, the image of her and Isabella as children, faces pressed together in a shared photo, a sudden, sharp pang of empathy. They were both victims, though the ways in which they suffered differed greatly. "I understand you were hurt, too," Amelia finally said, her voice a low tremor. "Abandoned. But that doesn't justify what you did." "I know," Isabella whispered, her voice breaking. "I never meant to cause this much pain. I wanted a family. And when I saw Julian, it felt like a chance, a desperate, reckless chance." The admission hung in the air, heavy with regret. Amelia remained silent, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The waves continued their relentless rhythm, a melancholic symphony to the unfolding drama of their lives. The path to forgiveness was long and arduous, but the first tentative step towards understanding had been taken. The mahogany desk in Julian's opulent study felt cold beneath his fingertips. The scent of old leather and expensive cigars, usually comforting, now clung to him like a shroud. He stared at the framed photograph of Amelia, her laughter captured in a fleeting moment, a stark contrast to the emptiness he felt. He'd spent weeks trying to reach her, his calls met with silence, his texts unanswered. The guilt gnawed at him, a constant, relentless ache. He poured himself a whiskey, the amber liquid a poor substitute for the warmth he craved. The city lights, a glittering tapestry viewed from his panoramic window, held no allure. His perfect life, once a source of immense pride, was now a shattered mosaic. He'd lost Amelia, and the unexpected familial connection with Isabella offered little solace. He picked up his phone, the cool glass a momentary distraction. He needed to talk to Isabella. He had to understand how she'd managed to infiltrate his life, to steal his heart, and to shatter his future all at once. He dialed her number, the ringing a jarring counterpoint to the quiet hum of the city. When she answered, her voice was strained, fragile. "Julian," she whispered, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. I don't know what to do." "Isabella," he began, his voice hoarse. "I need to understand. Why didn't you tell me sooner? About Amelia? About being sisters?" The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken emotions. He could practically feel the miles separating them, the distance a physical manifestation of their fractured relationship. "I was scared," she finally confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Scared of losing you, of losing any chance at a real family. I had nothing. And then, seeing you, seeing Amelia, it all felt connected. Twisted, I know, but it felt right in that moment." The city lights outside flickered, mirroring the turmoil within him. He understood, in a way, her desperation, her longing. But understanding wasn't the same as forgiveness. He'd betrayed Amelia, and that betrayal had unleashed a chain reaction that had shattered not just their lives, but the lives of 3 people. "We have to fix this," he said, his voice firmer now, laced with a newfound resolve. "For all of us." The weight of responsibility, of his actions, settled heavily on his shoulders. The long road to redemption had just begun. The sterile scent of antiseptic still clung to Amelia's apartment, a lingering ghost of the hospital where she'd been abandoned, a trauma now intertwined with the betrayal by Julian. Sunlight streamed through the large window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. She sat curled on the sofa, a worn photograph clutched in her hand, a blurry image of 2 toddlers, identical smiles mirroring a shared past she'd never known. The image of Isabella, her twin, her rival, her sister, swam before her eyes. A knock echoed, tentative, hesitant. Amelia didn't answer. Another knock, slightly firmer this time. It was Isabella. Amelia rose, her movements slow, deliberate. She opened the door a crack, her face etched with weariness. Isabella stood on the threshold, her eyes red-rimmed, her usual confident posture replaced by a hesitant vulnerability. "Amelia?" Isabella whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. Can we talk?" Amelia stared at her, the raw pain of betrayal still fresh, a wound that wouldn't easily heal. Yet, looking at Isabella, she saw a reflection of her own hurt, her own loneliness. A flicker of something akin to empathy stirred within her. "Talk about what?" Amelia's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, a mask protecting her fragile heart. Isabella stepped inside, her movements cautious, as if afraid of breaking something precious. She closed the door softly behind her, the silence heavy with unspoken words. The only sound was the gentle ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece, each tick a painful reminder of time lost, of opportunities missed. "About everything," Isabella breathed, her voice trembling. "About what happened, about us." She looked at the photograph in Amelia's hand, a shared memory bridging the chasm of their fractured lives. "I know I hurt you. I know I messed up everything. But I never wanted to hurt you, Amelia. Never." She paused, swallowing hard, her eyes welling up again. I wanted a family. I wanted someone." Amelia remained silent, her gaze fixed on Isabella. The weight of years of loneliness, of abandonment, warred with the dawning realization that she wasn't alone. The shared trauma, the shared past, forged an unexpected link, however fragile. The silence stretched, a space filled with the ghosts of their shared childhood, of their separate lives, and the devastating events that had brought them together again. The clock ticked on, each tick a step closer to reconciliation, or perhaps a further descent into the depths of their shared pain. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Julian's sprawling estate. He sat on the veranda, a half-empty glass of scotch sweating in his hand, the ice clinking a mournful rhythm against the crystal. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant chirping of crickets, a stark contrast to the boisterous wedding reception that had been violently interrupted. He watched Amelia's retreating figure from afar, a ghost of her former vibrancy, her usual sunshine replaced by a chilling pallor. The weight of his deceit pressed down on him, a crushing burden amplified by the unexpected revelation of Isabella's identity. He hadn't seen Amelia properly since the day of the ruined wedding. Her carefully constructed facade of composure had crumbled completely. He understood now the depth of her hurt, a hurt he'd caused, amplified by the sudden arrival of her identical twin. The revelation had blown apart his meticulously built world, leaving behind only the wreckage of shattered trust and broken promises. His guilt was a visceral thing, a constant ache in his chest. A soft footstep behind him startled him. He turned to see Isabella, her eyes mirroring the same desolate landscape reflected in his soul. She stood hesitant, her usual fiery confidence subdued, replaced by a fragile vulnerability. "Julian," she began, her voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry." He looked at her, seeing not the alluring mistress, but a lost and lonely woman, desperately searching for belonging. He saw a reflection of Amelia's pain in her eyes, a mirror image of the hurt he'd inflicted on both of them. "Sorry doesn't fix this, Isabella," he replied, his voice rough. "You can't undo the damage you've done." "I know," she sighed, running a hand through her hair. "But I wanted you to know. I never meant to hurt Amelia. I didn't know." Her voice cracked, the tears welling up, finally spilling down her cheeks. Finding Amelia, it's been overwhelming. I wanted a family, a connection, but I went about it the wrong way, a horribly wrong way. He watched her, the sharp edges of his anger softening, replaced by a dull ache of sympathy. He saw the depth of her regret, the genuine remorse in her eyes. He knew, in that moment, that her actions, however damaging, stemmed from a deep-seated longing for love and connection. A longing that mirrored his own desperate need for something real, something beyond superficial glamour. The weight of his own actions pressed down on him, intensifying as he stared at her brokenness. A reflection of his own fractured self. The perfect storm had indeed arrived, and he was left drowning in its aftermath, desperate to salvage what remained, no matter how fragile those fragments. The journey to redemption, however long and arduous, had to begin somewhere, with this shared acknowledgement of pain. The muted gray of the dawn seeped through the silk curtains, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the opulent bedroom. Julian lay rigid, the crisp cotton sheets a stark contrast to the turmoil churning within him. He hadn't slept, the image of Amelia's tear-streaked face etched into his memory. He reached for his phone, the cool glass a small comfort against the burning guilt. He scrolled through photos, Amelia's radiant smile at their engagement party, the mischievous glint in Isabella's eyes during their stolen moments. The similarities, once so alluringly different, now felt like a cruel mockery. He rose, the plush carpet cushioning his bare feet. The vastness of his bedroom, usually a symbol of his success, felt suffocating. He needed to see Amelia, to try again, to somehow mend the gaping hole he'd created. He found her in the garden, curled on a stone bench amidst the overgrown roses, their thorns mirroring the pricks of his betrayal. The first rays of sun painted her face in a melancholic light, highlighting the fragility he'd almost forgotten. "Amelia," he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. She didn't turn. He knelt beside her, the chill of the stone seeping into his knees. I need to talk to you," She finally turned, her eyes, the same hazel as Isabella's, filled with a weary sadness. "What's left to say, Julian? You've said everything." Her voice was low, devoid of the usual warmth. "I know I hurt you," he began, his voice cracking, "but I want you to understand." He paused, searching for the right words that could possibly bridge the chasm he'd created. "This, Isabella, it was a mistake, a terrible one. But finding out she's your twin, it changes everything." Amelia's gaze hardened. "Changes what, Julian? The fact that you betrayed me? That you lied? That you chose another woman? A woman who happens to be my twin? Over me?" A single tear traced a path down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail. He reached out, his hand hovering hesitantly above hers. He saw the tremor in her hand, the unspoken fear that he might never be worthy of her trust again. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, heavier than any burden he'd ever known. He pulled his hand back, aware that words alone were inadequate. The journey to reconciliation was a long and arduous one, and he was only at the very beginning. He had to show her, through actions, through genuine change, that he truly understood the devastation he had caused. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows, but Julian knew his own shadow of guilt would remain much longer. The road ahead was paved with his failures, and his only hope was to pave it with remorse, with the painstaking process of healing and atonement. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Julian's estate. Isabella sat alone by the reflecting pool, the cool water a stark contrast to the burning shame within her. The ornate gazebo, usually a symbol of romantic rendezvous, now felt like a gilded cage. The scent of lilies, once so intoxicating, now seemed cloying, mirroring the suffocating weight of her guilt. She traced the rim of a chipped teacup, the delicate porcelain a fragile echo of her own shattered hopes. The DNA results, the revelation of her twin, had ripped open a wound she hadn't known existed. She'd sought connection, a desperate yearning for a family she'd never had, but her actions had caused irreparable damage. A sob escaped her lips, a choked sound swallowed by the rustling leaves. She hadn't intended to hurt Amelia, to steal her fiancé. The resemblance, initially a tool of seduction, now felt like a cruel twist of fate. The shared past, unearthed through fragmented memories and old photographs, felt like a constant reminder of her own displacement, her own sense of being an imposter. Suddenly, a shadow fell across her. She looked up, startled, to see Amelia standing there, her expression unreadable. The afternoon sun glinted off Amelia's wedding ring, a stark reminder of what Isabella had nearly stolen. I wanted to talk," Amelia said, her voice surprisingly calm, a deceptive stillness that only heightened the tension. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken accusations. Isabella flinched, expecting anger, but Amelia's tone was different, measured, almost clinical. Isabella swallowed hard. "I'm so sorry, Amelia. Truly. I never meant to." Amelia interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "To what, Isabella? To steal my life? My fiancé? My very identity?" A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a stark contrast to the carefully controlled composure she maintained. Isabella looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the delicate fabric of her dress. "It wasn't like that. I was lost, so lost. I saw you in him. It wasn't deliberate, I swear." Amelia sighed, a long, weary sound. "I know you were lost, Isabella, but so was I when you took everything from me." She sat beside her, the distance between them suddenly collapsing. The shared trauma, the unexpected kinship, hung heavy in the air, a strange bridge built upon the ruins of betrayal. The sterile scent of antiseptic still clung to Isabella's clothes, a phantom reminder of the hospital where she'd been separated from Amelia a lifetime ago. She sat on the plush, velvet chaise lounge in Julian's study, the weight of the afternoon sun heavy on her shoulders. The room, usually vibrant with life, felt subdued, reflecting the turmoil within her. Julian paced, his expensive shoes barely whispering on the Persian rug. "I don't understand," he finally said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "How could this happen? How could I?" He stopped, unable to articulate the depth of his self-reproach. Isabella looked up, her eyes mirroring his despair. I wanted a family, Julian, a life I never had. Seeing you with Amelia, it was like seeing a reflection of everything I longed for. A twisted, misguided longing." Her voice cracked. "I know it's no excuse." The silence hung heavy, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. Julian ran a hand through his hair, the gesture revealing the strain he was under. The opulent surroundings, the leather-bound books, the antique desk, the view of the manicured gardens, felt like a cruel mockery of his shattered world. "Amelia, she deserves so much better," he murmured, his gaze distant. The unspoken question hung in the air. Did he deserve better? Did he even deserve forgiveness? A knock at the door. Julian's shoulders slumped further. It was Amelia. She stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes filled with a quiet strength that surprised Isabella. She wasn't raging. There was a chilling calm in her demeanor that was far more unsettling. "I need to talk to Isabella," Amelia said, her voice steady, controlled. She didn't look at Julian. Julian stepped aside, his eyes lingering on Amelia. A mixture of guilt and apprehension etched on his face. He left them alone, the closing of the door echoing the finality of his own shattered dreams. The weight of his betrayal pressed down on him, heavy and inescapable. He couldn't even begin to imagine the path to redemption. The silence that followed was deafening, a silence filled with the unspoken accusations and the fragile hope of possible reconciliation. The muted floral wallpaper of Amelia's guest room seemed to mock the vibrant life she'd once envisioned. Dust motes danced in the weak afternoon sun, filtering through the drawn curtains, illuminating the fragile fragility of her composure. Isabella sat opposite her, the opulent silk of her dress a stark contrast to the simplicity of Amelia's linen robe. The air hung heavy with unspoken accusations, the scent of lilies, Amelia's favorite, somehow tinged with the bitter tang of betrayal. I don't hate you," Amelia began, her voice barely a whisper, surprising both women. The words hung in the air, fragile as butterfly wings. Isabella flinched, her carefully constructed facade of composure wavering. "But," Isabella prompted, her voice tight. Amelia traced the rim of a chipped teacup, the porcelain cool against her trembling fingers. "But I need to understand. Why did you do this?" The question wasn't laced with venom. It was a plea for comprehension, a desperate search for a sliver of understanding in the wreckage of her world. Isabella's gaze fell to her clasped hands. The silence stretched, taut with emotion. Finally, she spoke, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I saw you, Amelia, with Julian. I saw your happiness, your completeness, and it felt like a wound I'd carried for my entire life, a gaping hole that I could never quite fill. You replaced me?" Amelia breathed, the words catching in her throat. Isabella shook her head vehemently. "No, it wasn't like that. I never wanted to hurt you. I wanted what you had. Family. A love that felt real, that didn't feel like a desperate, lonely grasping for something lost." She broke down, the carefully constructed wall crumbling into tears. The sound was raw, heartbreaking, and strangely familiar to Amelia. A shared vulnerability, a shared ache. The two women, bound by an invisible thread of DNA and a lifetime of separation, stared at each other, the years of absence suddenly dissolving into a shared, painful understanding. The lilies, once a symbol of joy, now seemed to represent the fragile beauty of a newfound kinship amidst the storm. The path to forgiveness remained a long, uncertain one, but for the first time, a glimmer of hope pierced the darkness. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to the air in Isabella's sparsely furnished apartment, a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings she'd been accustomed to. Sunlight, muted by the sheer curtains, cast long shadows across the worn carpet. She sat hunched on the edge of the sofa, a half-empty glass of water sweating condensation onto the polished wood. Regret, thick and suffocating, clung to her like the scent of lilies that still haunted her from the ruined wedding. A soft knock echoed through the quiet space. It was Amelia. Isabella's breath hitched. She'd expected anger, perhaps even violence. Instead, Amelia's entrance was quiet, almost hesitant. Her eyes, usually bright, were shadowed with exhaustion, yet held a flicker of something akin to curiosity. "Can I?" Amelia asked, her voice soft, almost a question. She held a small, worn photograph album in her hands. Isabella nodded, gesturing to the armchair opposite. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the faint ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece. The photograph album lay between them, a tangible link to a past neither fully understood. Amelia opened it, her fingers tracing the faded images. A shared childhood emerged. Two little girls with identical grins, identical pigtails, in matching dresses. A birthday party, a Christmas morning, a beach vacation. Memories Isabella had subconsciously suppressed, now surfacing with painful clarity. "I found these in the attic," Amelia said softly, turning a page to show a picture of them dressed as fairies, their identical features striking even in the blurry snapshot. "We look exactly alike." A single tear traced a path down Amelia's cheek. Isabella reached across the space between them, her hand hovering over Amelia's, then retracting. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words a raw confession. "For everything." Amelia didn't respond immediately, instead continuing to flip through the album, her eyes fixed on the pictures of their shared past. A past she'd only just discovered, a past Isabella had stolen from her. The silence held a new weight, a heavy blanket woven from shared sorrow and dawning understanding. It wasn't the reconciliation they craved, but it was a beginning. A fragile, tentative step toward a future where the shadows of the past might finally begin to fade. The album, once a symbol of a life stolen, now represented a bridge, tentatively built across the chasm of their fractured past. The opulent penthouse suite, usually a haven of luxury, felt oppressive. Amelia stared out at the city lights, a million pinpricks of defiance against the darkness swirling within her. The champagne flute in her hand, untouched, felt cold and heavy, mirroring the icy weight in her heart. Julian's attempts at reconciliation flowers, whispered apologies, promises of change, felt hollow, echoing in the cavernous emptiness of her emotional landscape. She hadn't spoken to him directly in days, her silence a wall he couldn't seem to breach. A soft knock. Isabella. Amelia hadn't wanted to see her, yet here she was, facing the woman who had not only stolen her fiancé, but also a piece of her own identity. Isabella entered, her usual flamboyant attire replaced by a simple, somber dress. Her eyes, usually bright with a predatory gleam, were shadowed with a weariness that mirrored Amelia's own. "Amelia?" Isabella began, her voice barely a whisper, a stark contrast to her usually confident tone. I wanted to apologize again. I know saying sorry isn't enough, but..." Amelia turned, her gaze sharp, unforgiving. The city lights seemed to blur, reflecting the turmoil within her. "Enough for what, Isabella? For stealing my fiancé? For stealing my life? For being my twin sister all along?" Each word was a carefully aimed dart, piercing through the thin veil of Isabella's forced composure. Isabella flinched, a visible tremor running through her. "It wasn't like that. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know you existed until..." Her voice cracked, the carefully constructed facade crumbling. Tears welled in her eyes, a stark contrast to the carefully applied makeup. The scent of her expensive perfume, usually so alluring, now felt cloying, suffocating. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken accusations and simmering resentment. The opulent surroundings seemed to amplify their unspoken pain, mocking their shattered lives. The tension hung palpable in the air, a silent battle waged between shared DNA and irreconcilable differences. The shared trauma, however, bound them, a grotesque bond forged in betrayal and lost identity. The fight, Amelia knew, was far from over. The battle for Julian, and for their shared past, had just begun. The opulent penthouse suite felt less like a sanctuary and more like a pressure cooker. Amelia, curled on the plush sofa, the silk cool against her burning skin, felt the city's relentless pulse mirroring the frantic beat of her own heart. Isabella's apology, a fragile thing, hung in the air like the scent of lilies, beautiful but ultimately unable to mask the underlying bitterness. The champagne, mockingly bubbly, remained untouched. "It wasn't like that," Isabella repeated, her voice trembling. The expensive perfume, usually a weapon of seduction, now clung to her like a shroud. Tears streamed down her face, blurring the sharp angles of her usually perfect makeup. "I had no idea. I was so alone." Amelia watched, her anger a smoldering ember rather than a raging fire. Isabella's vulnerability, raw and unexpected, chipped away at her icy resolve. The shared trauma, the echoing loss, was a bridge, however shaky, between them. Alone, Amelia's voice was barely a whisper, a stark contrast to the tempest that raged within. She picked up the untouched flute, the crystal cold against her fingers, a chilling echo of her own emotional state. "We both were abandoned, lost, and you used that to hurt me, to hurt us." The silence that followed was a heavy blanket, suffocating and profound. The city lights, glittering outside, offered no solace. Isabella reached out, a hesitant hand, as if to touch Amelia's arm, then withdrew, her gesture mirroring the fragility of her newfound hope. Days bled into weeks. Julian, a shadow of his former self, flitted between the two sisters, his apologies as hollow as the promises he'd made. He brought flowers, expensive chocolates, but the gestures felt clumsy, inadequate, a desperate attempt to mend a tapestry that had been brutally ripped apart. Amelia, despite her hurt, found herself increasingly drawn to Isabella, not out of forgiveness, but out of a shared understanding of abandonment. They began to talk, tentatively at first, sharing snippets of fragmented memories, a shared love of seashells, a recurring dream of a bustling hospital, the faint echo of a mother's lullaby. These fragments, like shards of a broken mirror, began to reflect a shared past, a life stolen before it had begun, a life both mourned and rediscovered. The pain remained, a sharp, constant ache, but amidst the wreckage, a fragile seedling of understanding began to grow. The battle wasn't over, but the battlefield had shifted, from bitter animosity to a tentative, uncertain truce. The fight for Julian was far from settled, but the fight for themselves, for their shared identity, had begun. The therapist's office smelled faintly of lavender and old books, a stark contrast to the opulent scent of champagne and lilies that still clung to Amelia's memory. She sat stiffly on the plush couch, the soft cushions offering no comfort. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, mirroring the turmoil swirling within her. "It's overwhelming," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper, lost in the quiet space. Dr. Anya Sharma, a woman whose calm demeanor belied a sharp intellect, nodded slowly. "The revelation of a twin sister, the betrayal by your fiancé. It's understandable that you feel overwhelmed." Anya's voice was gentle yet firm. Amelia looked down at her hands, gnarled and calloused despite the manicures she'd once favored. The rings, symbols of a future now shattered, were gone. "I keep seeing her face," Amelia said, her voice cracking. "Isabella's face. It's everywhere. In my dreams, in the reflection of shop windows, even in the patterns on the carpet." She shuddered, the chill settling deep in her bones. The shared memories, once fragments, were now coalescing into a vivid tapestry of a life she never knew existed. A life shared with a woman who'd stolen her fiancé. "The anger is natural," Anya said softly, "but underneath I sense a deeper pain, a sense of loss." Amelia nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Lost, that's the word. Lost at birth, lost to a life I never knew, lost to the man I thought I loved." And then to find her only to have her take everything. The bitterness seeped back into her voice. "And what about Isabella?" Anya asked, her voice calm. "What do you think motivates her? Regret? Fear? Maybe a desperate need for connection?" Amelia pondered, a flicker of something akin to empathy crossing her face. She was alone too, abandoned, just like me. A painful sigh escaped her lips. But that doesn't excuse what she did. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken emotions. The scent of lavender seemed to intensify, a fragile balm in the midst of her emotional storm. Amelia knew the path to healing wouldn't be easy. The road ahead was fraught with uncertainty, but for the first time, a glimmer of something akin to hope pierced the darkness. The anger remained, a vital part of her healing process, but it was no longer all-consuming. The seeds of understanding were sown. The hard work of growth had begun. The opulent penthouse suite felt colder now, stripped of its wedding day opulence. Empty champagne flutes glittered dully under the harsh fluorescent lights, mocking the celebratory atmosphere that had vanished like morning mist. Amelia paced, the plush carpet a muted whisper beneath her bare feet. The lingering scent of lilies, once intoxicating, now felt suffocating. Isabella sat on the edge of the vast bed, clutching a worn photograph, a faded image of two tiny babies, identical smiles gracing their faces. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken accusations and nascent understanding. I didn't know," Isabella finally whispered, her voice trembling. Tears streamed down her face, tracing paths through the expertly applied makeup, a stark contrast to the carefully constructed facade she'd presented at the wedding. "I didn't know she was my sister." Amelia stopped pacing, her gaze fixed on Isabella. The anger, still a potent force, was battling with a confusing surge of something else. Pity? Empathy? The thought was both terrifying and liberating. "Knowing doesn't excuse what you did," Amelia said, her voice raw with emotion. "You stole him. You stole everything." Isabella flinched. The harsh words, though justified, felt like a physical blow. I wanted a family," she choked out, her voice barely audible. "I was so alone, and when I met him, I thought—" She trailed off, unable to articulate the tangled mess of desire, desperation, and misplaced longing. Amelia approached the bed, the distance between them shrinking. The photograph, a tangible link to a past they both shared, hung between them, a silent testament to their intertwined destinies. "I was alone too," Amelia admitted, her voice softening. The bitterness remained, but it was losing its sharp edge. "Abandoned, just like you." The shared pain, the unspoken understanding of abandonment, created an unexpected bridge. The vast gulf between them, previously defined by betrayal, began to shrink, filled with the fragile tendrils of empathy. The air, heavy with unshed tears and unspoken words, felt less suffocating. The faint chill of the room seemed to lessen. A tentative step towards reconciliation, however fragile, had been taken. The muted sunlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows cast long shadows across the opulent penthouse suite, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the still air. The remnants of the ruined wedding feast lay scattered, a stark contrast to the lavish preparations of just hours before. Amelia, curled on a plush velvet chaise lounge, clutched a silk pillow, its scent of lavender doing little to soothe her frayed nerves. The initial shock had given way to a bone-deep weariness, a chilling emptiness. Isabella, meanwhile, sat at the grand piano, her fingers hesitantly tracing the ivory keys. A single melancholic note resonated through the silent apartment, a perfect echo of her inner turmoil. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, heavier than any crown. "It's beautiful," Amelia murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, more to herself than to Isabella. Isabella turned, her eyes red-rimmed, her carefully composed mask crumbling. "It's a lie," she replied, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Everything I built, everything I pretended, a lie." Amelia sat up, her gaze softening. The anger, though still present, had lost some of its sharp edges. The shared experience of betrayal, the shared pain of abandonment, was forging an unexpected bond. "The lie is what kept us apart for so long," Amelia offered, her voice gentler now. "But the truth is starting to surface." A fragile silence settled between them, punctuated only by the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. The scent of lilies, once synonymous with celebration, now held the sharp tang of regret. Isabella rose, approaching Amelia slowly, her movements hesitant, uncertain. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered, her voice trembling. I wanted what you had." Amelia reached out, her hand finding Isabella's. The contact was unexpected, tentative, a silent acknowledgement of shared pain and a hesitant step towards forgiveness. The cool touch of Isabella's hand sent a shiver down Amelia's spine, a tremor that echoed the seismic shift occurring within her own heart. The bitter taste of betrayal remained, but a new flavor was emerging, the bittersweet taste of empathy. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges, but for the first time, a glimmer of hope, fragile as a butterfly's wing, flickered in the cold penthouse suite. The shared silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken emotions. The scent of lilies, bruised and fading, hung in the air, a morbid reminder of the wedding that never was. Outside, the city thrummed with a life Amelia felt utterly detached from. She watched Isabella, her twin, her rival, her sister. The word felt foreign, clumsy on her tongue, yet strangely fitting. Isabella's fingers still hovered over the piano keys, a delicate dance of hesitation. "I don't know what to say," Isabella finally whispered, her voice breaking. Tears streamed down her face, leaving glistening trails through the carefully applied makeup. The flawless facade she had maintained throughout the day crumbled, revealing the vulnerable woman beneath. Amelia sighed, the sound a weary exhale. The plush velvet of the chaise lounge felt cold against her skin, mirroring the chill that settled in her heart. "Say you're sorry," she replied, her voice soft but firm. The anger had ebbed, replaced by a profound sadness, a sadness that resonated with the sorrow she saw mirrored in Isabella's eyes. Isabella nodded, a single, almost imperceptible movement. "I am sorry," she choked out, the words laden with genuine remorse. "I am so sorry, Amelia. I never wanted to hurt you. I wanted a family. I wanted what you had." The words hung in the air, a fragile bridge between two fractured souls. Amelia saw a flicker of the girl she herself might have been, lost, lonely, yearning for connection. A shared childhood, stolen by fate, now re-emerging through the wreckage of a shattered engagement. A shared pain, a shared longing. "I understand," Amelia said, her voice barely a whisper. She reached out, her hand covering Isabella's. The touch was tentative, hesitant, a fragile promise of reconciliation. The cool porcelain of Isabella's skin contrasted with the warmth of Amelia's, a silent exchange of unspoken emotions. The weight of the day, of the betrayal, of the unexpected truth, lessened slightly under the unexpected weight of shared empathy. The lilies, the piano, the opulent penthouse, all faded into the background as a tentative bond began to form, born from shared loss and a burgeoning sense of sisterhood. The path ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time since the shattering revelation, a sliver of hope pierced the darkness. The next morning, sunlight, pale and hesitant, filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Amelia's penthouse suite, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the otherwise silent room. The remnants of the previous night's chaos, scattered champagne flutes, wilted lilies, a discarded veil, lay scattered like fallen trophies of a brutal battle. Amelia awoke with a sigh, the lingering scent of lilies a bitter reminder of the devastation. Her head throbbed, a dull counterpoint to the sharp ache in her heart. Isabella stirred on the chaise lounge, her face pale, etched with the shadows of a sleepless night. She looked fragile, almost childlike, the carefully constructed facade of the alluring mistress gone, replaced by raw vulnerability. Amelia watched her, a wave of unexpected compassion washing over her. The anger, the betrayal, hadn't vanished, but it was muted, softened by the shared trauma that bound them. "Coffee," Amelia offered, her voice raspy from disuse. The simple act felt monumental, a tentative bridge across the chasm of their fractured reality. Isabella nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. As Amelia moved towards the kitchen, the clinking of porcelain cups against saucers felt jarringly loud in the hushed apartment. The rhythmic drip of the espresso machine provided a strangely comforting counterpoint to the silent turmoil swirling within them. Bringing the steaming mugs back to the chaise lounge, Amelia sat beside Isabella, the warmth of the coffee a small comfort against the chill in the air. I want to understand," Isabella began, her voice trembling slightly. "Why you forgave me so easily?" Amelia smiled wryly, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. "Forgave you? I haven't forgiven you, Isabella. But I see you. I see the hurt, the loneliness, the desperate need for connection that drove you to do what you did. And in seeing that, I see a reflection of myself, a mirror of my own past fears and insecurities." She paused, her gaze fixed on the steam curling from her cup. "We both lost something precious a long time ago, and we both reached out for it in our own desperate ways." The unspoken words hung between them, the shared loss of their childhood, the stolen sisterhood, the crushing weight of abandonment. The silence that followed was not heavy with unspoken resentments, but with the shared weight of understanding, the beginning of a fragile, tentative reconciliation. The scent of chamomile tea, a calming antidote to the storm of the previous day, hung in the air. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Amelia's opulent study, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. Amelia, perched on a plush velvet armchair, watched Isabella sketch in a large leather-bound book. The rhythmic scratch of charcoal on paper filled the silence, a surprisingly soothing counterpoint to the lingering tension. Isabella, usually vibrant and self-assured, appeared subdued, her usual sharp angles softened by fatigue. "It's beautiful," Amelia murmured, her voice still a little rough. Isabella looked up, a flicker of a smile touching her lips. "It's a memory," she whispered, her eyes distant, tracing the lines of a half-finished drawing of a bustling hospital corridor. "From before everything." A shared silence settled between them, a comfortable silence this time, devoid of accusations. Amelia picked up a framed photograph from the nearby desk, a faded picture of two young girls, identical smiles frozen in time. "We were so alike," she said softly, her fingers tracing the outline of one of the girls. "Like two halves of a whole, separated and then thrown into wildly different lives," Isabella added, a sigh escaping her lips. "I always felt incomplete, a puzzle piece searching for its other half." Amelia nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. The years of loneliness, of yearning for a connection she couldn't name, now made perfect sense. The chasm between them, once a vast gulf of betrayal, was slowly filling with the shared experience of loss and the unexpected discovery of a bond deeper than they could have ever imagined. "I never had a sister," Amelia said, her voice catching slightly. "I always secretly wished I did." Isabella's gaze met Amelia's, a warmth replacing the earlier guardedness. "Me too," she confessed, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "I spent my whole life searching for someone I didn't even know I was missing." The unspoken words hung between them, a shared longing for family, for belonging, for the sisterhood stolen from them years ago. The afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room, painting the scene in hues of orange and purple as the two sisters, finally finding common ground, began to slowly mend their fractured reality. The weight of his actions pressed down on Julian like a physical burden. He sat alone in his sprawling, yet suddenly empty mansion, the opulent decor mocking his inner turmoil. The faint scent of lilies, Amelia's favorite, clung to the air, a painful reminder of his shattered life. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the cool marble of the desk a stark contrast to the burning shame within him. He'd spent the afternoon attempting to write a letter to Amelia, 1,000 apologies swirling in his mind, yet failing to translate into coherent words. Each attempt ended in a crumpled mess, his neat script betraying his emotional chaos. The silence of the house was deafening, broken only by the occasional tick of a grandfather clock, each chime a heavy hammer blow to his already fractured self-esteem. The guilt gnawed at him, a relentless beast. He wasn't just regretting the affair. He was confronting the depths of his own selfishness, his blindness to Amelia's vulnerabilities, his casual disregard for the consequences of his actions. He had destroyed their perfect life, and in doing so had inadvertently brought together two halves of a soul, a family he had never known existed. The irony wasn't lost on him. He took a deep breath, the cool night air offering little solace. He needed to confront Isabella. He needed to understand her perspective, to grasp the reasons behind her actions. Perhaps understanding her would somehow lessen the burden of his own guilt. He picked up his phone, the smooth glass cold against his skin, the digital light a stark contrast to the shadows gathering in the room. He hesitated, the simple act of dialing a number feeling monumental. He imagined Isabella's face, the mixture of vulnerability and defiance that always seemed to clash within her. He knew he had hurt her too, though in a far different way than he had hurt Amelia. He owed them both an apology, a sincere and honest reckoning with his actions. But he also knew that apologies were meaningless without significant change. He had to prove his remorse, not just through words, but through actions that spoke louder than any letter or conversation could ever manage. The road ahead was long and arduous, but for the first time, Julian felt a flicker of resolve, a glimmer of hope amidst the wreckage of his perfect life. The call to Isabella would be just the first step. The scent of lilies, still lingering from the ruined wedding, clung to Isabella like a shroud. She sat on the edge of her hotel bed, the crisp white sheets a stark contrast to the turmoil within. Julian's call had been unexpected, a tremor in the earthquake of her life. She'd spent the day wrestling with guilt, a guilt amplified by the jarring revelation of her twin sister. The shared childhood photos, unearthed amidst the chaos, felt both familiar and alien. A pang of longing, sharp and sudden, pierced her. The phone buzzed again, displaying Julian's name. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the answer button. "Hello?" she answered, her voice barely a whisper. Julian's voice, tight with unshed tears, filled the small room. "Isabella? I need to talk to you. I know I can't undo what I've done, but..." His voice cracked, a raw vulnerability she'd never witnessed before. "I know," Isabella replied, her own voice thick with emotion. The shared trauma, the unexpected familial connection, had created an odd sense of kinship between them. "But what you did, it affected us both and Amelia too. I understand." Julian's voice was low, heavy with remorse. I want to understand you. Why did you do it, Isabella? It wasn't just an affair. It was a betrayal on so many levels." The words hung in the air, charged with unspoken grief and regret. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the hum of the city outside and the frantic beat of Isabella's heart. She looked around the sterile hotel room, the plush carpet and expensive artwork seeming grotesquely out of place considering the wreckage of her life and theirs. "I wanted a family," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "A life. I felt so alone, so lost. Finding Amelia, it was a revelation, a painful, terrifying revelation. And seeing you, seeing the life I could have had." Her voice trailed off, unable to articulate the complexities of her desperate longing, the echo of a childhood lost. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, as heavy as Julian's. A new wave of tears threatened to spill, as if the dam holding back years of hurt had finally begun to crack. The sterile scent of antiseptic still clung to Isabella's memory, a phantom smell from the hospital where she'd been separated from Amelia. Now, sitting across from Julian in a dimly lit cafe, the aroma of strong coffee and warm bread offered a fragile counterpoint to the lingering trauma. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked window, mirroring the hazy state of her emotions. Julian shifted in his seat, his expensive suit looking oddly crumpled, a testament to the emotional upheaval he'd endured. "Isabella," he began, his voice low and hesitant. I've been thinking." He paused, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "About us, about Amelia, about everything." Isabella met his gaze, her own eyes reflecting the city's muted glow. The confession had been raw, a stripping bare of her deepest insecurities. The revelation of Amelia's existence had been a double-edged sword, a painful echo of her own sense of displacement. "I understand," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, a crushing burden. "But I don't understand why," Julian continued, his voice thick with unshed tears. He reached for his coffee, his hand trembling slightly. "You had everything, a life of luxury, the attention. Why risk it all for me?" Isabella's gaze drifted to the rain-lashed street. "It wasn't just about you, Julian," she said, her voice barely a murmur. "It was about belonging, about having a family, something I never had." The memories surfaced, a fragmented childhood, punctuated by fleeting glimpses of a loving mother, snatched away by circumstance. The hospital evacuation, the chaos, the searing loss. Finding that semblance of a life I'd always craved. It was intoxicating. She closed her eyes, battling back tears. "And then finding Amelia?" Julian's voice was soft, laced with a newfound understanding. It shattered. A long silence descended, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of rain against the cafe windows. The shared trauma, the sudden familial connection, hung heavy in the air, a palpable link between them. Despite everything, a fragile understanding began to bloom, a shared acknowledgement of the complex web of emotions that bound them together, despite the damage they'd inflicted. The road ahead remained uncertain, fraught with challenges and heartache. But in that quiet cafe, amidst the city's relentless rhythm, a faint glimmer of hope emerged, a shared willingness to confront the past, to begin the long, arduous process of healing. The mahogany desk in Julian's study felt cold beneath his hands. Rain lashed against the tall windows, mirroring the tempest in his soul. He stared at a framed photo, Amelia's radiant smile, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within him. He'd spent the last few days avoiding both women, the weight of his actions a suffocating burden. Guilt gnawed at him, a relentless tide eroding his carefully constructed world. He picked up his phone, the cool glass a stark contrast to the heat rising in his chest. He hesitated, then dialed Amelia's number. The ringing tone echoed his own internal dissonance, a jarring counterpoint to the gentle patter of rain. She answered on the third ring, her voice tight with unshed tears. "Julian," she said, the single word heavy with accusation. "Amelia," he replied, his voice a hoarse whisper. I need to talk to you." He could practically feel her reluctance, the guardedness in her tone. The conversation was difficult, stilted at first, punctuated by long silences filled only with the sound of rain and the unspoken accusations hanging heavy in the air. He poured out his remorse, his words clumsy and inadequate against the enormity of his betrayal. He spoke of his awakening, a slow, painful process of self-reflection. He spoke of seeing beyond his own desires and selfishness, of finally recognizing Amelia's own quiet vulnerabilities he'd previously dismissed. He admitted the thrill of the affair had blinded him to the depth of his feelings for Amelia, to the very essence of the woman he was about to lose. The city lights blurred outside, mirroring the unsteady emotions swirling within him. He spoke of his desire to rebuild their shattered trust, brick by painful brick, knowing it would take time and unwavering commitment. He ended the call with a heavy heart, but a small ember of hope ignited within him. Amelia's breathy, "I need time," was not the definitive no he'd feared. He had to earn her forgiveness, not just her understanding. The road ahead was long, but he was finally ready to walk it. The aroma of rosemary and lavender, a subtle attempt at peace, hung in the air of Amelia's sun-drenched garden. Isabella sat opposite her, a hesitant smile playing on her lips. The wrought iron table between them seemed a stark barrier, yet the afternoon sun warmed them both. A robin chirped a cheerful melody, a jarring contrast to the unspoken weight between the sisters. I never knew," Isabella began, her voice soft, laced with a vulnerability that mirrored Amelia's own. She picked at a loose thread on her skirt, her eyes avoiding Amelia's gaze. "About the evacuation, about being separated. It's all a blur." Amelia nodded, her own memories a fragmented tapestry of fear and confusion. The shared trauma, now revealed, created an unexpected bridge between them. "Mama always said it was a fire," she whispered, a wave of grief washing over her. "But I never believed it. I remember bits and pieces," Isabella confessed, her voice barely audible. "A bright light, screams, then nothing. I woke up in a different world, a different family." Silence settled between them, a comfortable silence this time, filled not with animosity but with a shared understanding of loss and displacement. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the garden. The robin's song faded, replaced by the gentle hum of bees amongst the lavender. Amelia reached across the table, her hand resting gently on Isabella's. The touch was unexpected, yet both sisters felt a deep connection. "I'm sorry," Amelia said, the words brimming with genuine empathy. "For the anger, for the judgment. I was so hurt, so lost." Tears welled in Isabella's eyes. "Me too," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I never meant to hurt you. I wanted a family." The confession hung in the air, a simple statement that carried the weight of a lifetime of longing. The shared pain, the shared loss, began to dissolve the barriers that had separated them for so long. The sun finally set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, mirroring the burgeoning hope in their hearts. The garden, once a symbol of Amelia's solitude, now felt like the birthplace of a new, unexpected sisterhood. The scent of wood smoke and roasting lamb hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile scent of the hospital where their lives had diverged decades ago. Julian, watching from the periphery, felt the familiar pang of guilt. He'd arranged this impromptu barbecue, a clumsy attempt at reconciliation, in Amelia's sprawling backyard. The crackling fire cast dancing shadows on their faces, highlighting the raw vulnerability etched onto Amelia's usually composed features. Isabella, surprisingly, seemed relaxed, even comfortable. "It's strange," Amelia said, her voice barely a whisper, more to herself than to anyone else. She stirred the embers with a long poker, her movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. "To be sisters," Isabella smiled, a hesitant, fragile thing. "It is, but it feels right somehow, like a missing piece." Her eyes flickered towards Julian, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. Julian cleared his throat, the sound loud in the sudden silence. He took a deep breath, the cool night air doing little to soothe the burning anxiety in his chest. "I know I messed up terribly. There's no excuse for what I did." He looked at Amelia, his gaze pleading. "But I want to fix it. I want to be a better man for both of you." Amelia didn't meet his gaze. She picked up a small, smooth stone from beside the fire, turning it over and over in her hands. "Fixing it. That's a tall order, Julian." Her voice was quiet, but the underlying steel was unmistakable. This whole situation, it's not something you can just undo." The fire crackled, spitting sparks into the night sky. The flames mirrored the turmoil raging within all three of them. Isabella reached across the small space between them, gently placing her hand on Amelia's. The touch was unexpected, tender, a silent offering of understanding. The air, thick with unspoken emotions, began to shift, the weight of betrayal slowly giving way to the fragile beginnings of something new. The aroma of lamb mingled with the scent of the wood smoke, creating a surprisingly comforting blend, a fragile promise of healing in the heart of the night. The following days were a blur of awkward silences and hesitant conversations. The opulent wedding suite, once a symbol of Julian's meticulously planned future, now felt like a mausoleum of shattered dreams. Amelia retreated to a quiet corner of the sprawling estate, the vastness emphasizing her solitude. The sunlight, streaming through the arched windows, seemed to mock her grief. She found solace only in long walks through the manicured gardens, the scent of roses a bittersweet reminder of a love betrayed. Isabella, meanwhile, hovered on the periphery, a ghost in the grand house. Guilt gnawed at her, a constant companion. She'd sought connection, a family, but her actions had caused irreparable damage. Seeing Amelia's quiet despair was a constant, agonizing reminder of her own selfishness. One evening, the three of them found themselves gathered in the library, the air thick with unspoken tension. The crackling fire in the hearth cast flickering shadows on the walls, lined with leather-bound books, silent witnesses to their turmoil. Julian, nervously twisting a silver ring on his finger, finally spoke. I wanted to apologize again, he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. For everything. Amelia met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. Apologies are cheap, Julian, she said, her voice low and steady. Actions speak louder than words. Show me, through your actions, that you're truly sorry, that you're willing to change. Isabella, watching the exchange, felt a pang of sympathy for both of them. She cleared her throat, the sound fragile in the quiet room. Amelia, she began, her voice trembling slightly. I know I can't erase what happened, but I want you to know, I never meant to hurt you. She looked at Amelia, her eyes filled with genuine remorse. I was just so desperate for a connection, for a family. A silence settled over them, heavy and profound. The only sound was the crackling fire, a steady rhythm in the heart of their emotional storm. The scent of old books and burning wood filled the air, a poignant backdrop to their unspoken emotions. The weight of their shared past, the wreckage of their present, hung between them, heavy and inescapable. But within that weight, a flicker of something else began to emerge. A fragile, tentative hope for healing, a possibility of reconciliation in the ashes of their broken dreams. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the breakfast table, illuminating the untouched plates. The opulent setting, crystal glasses, silver cutlery, a linen tablecloth the color of fresh snow, mocked the emptiness within them. Amelia sat staring out at the meticulously manicured lawns, the vibrant green a stark contrast to the grayness in her heart. Julian, his face etched with fatigue, poured himself a cup of coffee, the clinking sound jarring in the silence. Isabella, pale and withdrawn, sat hunched over a half-eaten croissant, her eyes red-rimmed. I'm going for a walk, Amelia announced, her voice barely above a whisper, her words carrying the weight of unshed tears. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the polished floor. Julian reached out, his hand hovering in midair. He swallowed, his throat tight with unshed tears. Amelia, he began, but she was already gone. Isabella watched her go, her gaze lingering on Amelia's retreating figure. The guilt, a constant companion, tightened its grip. She pushed her plate away, the half-eaten croissant suddenly repulsive. It's my fault, she murmured, her voice barely audible. Julian finally met her gaze, the weariness in his eyes mirroring her own. No, he said softly. It's not just your fault. It's mine too. He looked around the breakfast room. The grandeur felt suffocating. He rose and moved to the window, joining Isabella. He stood beside her, the silence between them filled only with the chirping of birds and a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the ancient oak tree. He watched Amelia walking away, her grief seemingly visible as a tangible presence. I'm ready to do whatever it takes to make amends, Julian said, his voice raspy. He looked at Isabella, a fragile hope emerging in his eyes. For all of us. He turned to look at Isabella, seeing the deep sorrow in her eyes. "We're in this together, right?" Isabella nodded slowly, tears welling up. I want to help," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I want to be part of the family I never had." The weight of her past actions hung heavy in the air, yet there was a spark of hope in her voice. A tentative beginning, the start of understanding, a new foundation. Later that afternoon, a shared cup of tea in the library seemed to lessen the distance between them. The crackling fire created a soothing warmth against the chill in the air. The quiet was filled with understanding, a sense of shared burden. The room's silent witness to their turmoil, this time holding hope rather than despair. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sprawling estate. Amelia, wrapped in a thick cashmere shawl, sat on a weathered bench overlooking the rose garden. The scent of roses, usually a delight, felt cloying, a suffocating sweetness mirroring the turmoil in her heart. Julian found her there, a hesitant figure silhouetted against the vibrant blooms. He sat beside her, the silence stretching between them, punctuated only by the gentle hum of bees. "Amelia," he began, his voice barely a whisper. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want to try, to be a better man." Amelia didn't turn, her gaze fixed on a wilting rose. "Trying isn't enough, Julian." Her voice was low, devoid of the usual warmth. The words hung heavy in the air, sharp and precise, each syllable carrying the weight of her hurt. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away, but neither did she allow him to touch her. "I understand your anger," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I deserve it, but I also want you to understand the depth of my regret. I destroyed something precious, something real." He paused, searching for the right words, his eyes filled with a genuine remorse that seemed to reach beyond the surface. The silence stretched again, this time laced with a fragile hope. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, a breathtaking spectacle that failed to touch Amelia's sorrow. Yet, in that shared silence, a subtle shift occurred. The rigid lines of her shoulders softened ever so slightly. A tiny crack appeared in the wall of her pain. "Isabella, she's hurting too," he said, his voice barely a murmur. "She's lost so much, just like you. She's my responsibility as well." Amelia finally turned, her eyes, though still clouded with sadness, held a flicker of something else, curiosity. "Responsibility?" she repeated softly, her voice tinged with disbelief, but also a touch of something like understanding. The seeds of forgiveness, perhaps, taking root in the fertile ground of her grief. The weight of the situation rested heavily between them, a burden, yet a shared one. The path ahead was long, but the first steps had been taken. The roses around them seemed to hold their breath. The following evening, a hesitant peace settled over the sprawling estate. The air, thick with the scent of jasmine and night-blooming lilies, hung heavy and sweet. Inside, the grand dining room, usually vibrant with laughter, was bathed in the soft glow of candlelight. Amelia, surprisingly, sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her posture still rigid but less defiant. Isabella sat opposite her, her usual flamboyant attire replaced by a simple, elegant dress that somehow amplified her vulnerability. Julian sat between them, a silent mediator, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a quiet attentiveness. The silence was punctuated only by the clinking of silverware and the occasional rustle of fabric. Julian watched, his heart a tight knot in his chest. He'd prepared a simple meal, hoping the familiarity of a shared dinner might ease the tension. He'd failed spectacularly at that. The unspoken accusations hung heavy in the air, a tangible presence. Isabella finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. I never meant to hurt you, Amelia." Her gaze, usually sparkling with mischief, was now filled with a deep sorrow. Tears welled in her eyes, threatening to spill. Amelia's gaze remained fixed on her plate, her expression unreadable. The clink of her fork against the porcelain was the only response. The weight of betrayal, the shock of discovering a twin, the raw agony of losing the man she loved, all played out on her face, a subtle shifting of emotions. Julian cleared his throat. We all made mistakes, Isabella, Amelia, myself included, but we can try to move forward. His voice was unsteady but sincere. He reached for Amelia's hand, his touch tentative, respectful of her space. She didn't pull away. A slow, hesitant smile touched Amelia's lips. Perhaps, she whispered, her voice husky, but trust takes time. The weight of her words resonated with the quiet clatter of cutlery and the gentle hum of the candles. The air, once thick with tension, now held a fragile hope, a quiet acceptance of the arduous path ahead. A shared meal, a small step towards forgiveness, and perhaps, just perhaps, towards a new and unconventional family. The unspoken question lingered. Could they truly forgive and rebuild? Or would the wounds prove too deep? The answer remained elusive, hidden in the flickering candlelight, mirroring the uncertain future that lay ahead. Days bled into weeks. The opulent estate, once a stage for Julian's meticulously planned wedding, now echoed with a muted sorrow. The jasmine's scent, once celebratory, now felt heavy, a cloying reminder of the shattered dreams. Amelia, though still fragile, began tentatively to engage with Isabella. The shared trauma, initially a barrier, became strangely fertile ground for a nascent connection. One afternoon, bathed in the soft light filtering through the conservatory's arched windows, they sat amidst a riot of orchids and ferns. Isabella, clutching a faded photograph of two giggling toddlers, spoke hesitantly. This was taken just before everything changed. Her voice trembled, a vulnerability starkly different from her usual confident facade. Amelia, gazing at the image, a mirror reflecting her own lost past, reached out, her touch gentle. I remember bits and pieces, a red wagon, a carousel, a feeling of safety before it all vanished. The shared memories, fragmented and incomplete, sparked a flicker of recognition, a kinship forged in the crucible of shared loss. Tears welled in both their eyes, unspoken understanding bridging the chasm of years and betrayal. The unspoken competition for Julian's affection faded, replaced by a fragile empathy. They spoke for hours, their voices a soft counterpoint to the conservatory's gentle hum. The weight of their shared past, once a source of conflict, now formed a bond as strong as the vines intertwining overhead. The scent of damp earth and blooming flowers, strangely comforting. This shared grief, this slow, tentative reconciliation, marked a turning point. The road to forgiveness was long, but the first steps had been taken. The air, once thick with betrayal, now held the delicate promise of a burgeoning sisterhood. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sprawling lawn, painting the manicured hedges in shades of gold and amber. Inside, the grand living room, usually vibrant with laughter and champagne flutes, held a different energy, a quiet intensity. Amelia sat curled on a plush velvet sofa, a half-finished cup of tea growing cold beside her. Her gaze drifted to the sprawling gardens, a reflection of her own internal turmoil, wild and untamed yet striving for order. Julian, hesitant yet determined, approached. He sat beside her, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken emotions. The scent of lilies, usually a symbol of purity and love, felt heavy now, burdened by the weight of their fractured relationship. Amelia, he began, his voice a low murmur, I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want you to know. He paused, searching for the right words, his eyes reflecting the turmoil within. Amelia met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Know what, Julian? Her voice was quiet, controlled, but the tremor in her hand betrayed her inner struggle. That Isabella, finding her, it was a shock, a terrible, terrible shock, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But it doesn't excuse my actions, my betrayal. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers, then retreated, recognizing the fragility of the moment. The unspoken question hung in the air. Could he truly earn her forgiveness? Could he earn back her trust? He continued, his words carefully chosen. I understand if you can't forgive me, but I want you to know that I'm working on myself. I'm going to therapy, facing my own demons. I'm not looking for an easy way out. Amelia's eyes flickered, a hint of something thawing in the icy landscape of her hurt. The faint clinking of ice in her untouched teacup was the only sound, underlining the fragile stillness of the moment. The scent of wood smoke drifted in from the fireplace, a subtle reminder of the warmth they once shared, a warmth he desperately hoped to rekindle. The unspoken words hung heavier than the scent of lilies, a silent negotiation between forgiveness and despair. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows, a metaphor for the long road ahead. But in that hushed room, a single fragile seed of hope had been planted. The following weeks unfolded in a blur of tentative steps and hesitant gestures. Amelia and Isabella, initially locked in a silent battle of hurt and suspicion, found themselves drawn together by an invisible thread of shared history. The scent of old photographs, unearthed from dusty boxes, filled the air, a nostalgic perfume of childhoods lived separately, yet strangely intertwined. One rainy afternoon, huddled together on a plush daybed, Amelia traced the lines of a faded photograph, a picture of two identical little girls in matching dresses. She looks just like me, Isabella whispered, her voice thick with a mixture of awe and sadness. The shared trauma of separation, once a chasm between them, began to soften into a fragile bridge of empathy. The shared grief, a silent language spoken through tear-filled eyes and shared memories, slowly chipped away at the icy walls of their animosity. Laughter, hesitant at first, then blossoming into genuine mirth, filled the quiet corners of the sprawling mansion. They started sharing stories, filling in the blanks of their fragmented past. Amelia learned of Isabella's longing for a sister, her years of searching, her painful sense of displacement. Isabella, in turn, discovered Amelia's quiet insecurities, her fears of not being enough, fears that Julian's infidelity had brutally exposed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and deep violet, they sat on the terrace, sipping chamomile tea. The soft murmur of their voices blended with the gentle rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. It's strange, isn't it? Amelia said, her voice barely a whisper, that the man who broke my heart brought us together. Isabella nodded, her eyes reflecting the twilight sky. He hurt us both, she replied softly. But maybe something good can come from it. A faint smile touched her lips, a glimmer of hope in the shadowed landscape of their shared past. The unspoken understanding hung heavy in the air, a testament to their burgeoning bond, a bond forged in the crucible of betrayal and heartbreak, yet blossoming into something unexpectedly beautiful. The scent of night-blooming jasmine, sweet and intoxicating, filled the air, a fragrant promise of a new dawn. The sprawling kitchen, usually a stage for bustling wedding preparations, now held a fragile peace. Sunlight streamed through the arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Amelia, sipping chamomile tea, watched Isabella carefully arrange a bouquet of wildflowers, a stark contrast to the opulent arrangements that had adorned the wedding. The scent of chamomile mingled with the earthy fragrance of the blooms, a calming balm to the storm that had ravaged their lives. I never had a sister, Isabella said softly, her voice barely audible above the gentle hum of the refrigerator. Her fingers, nimble and graceful, continued their work, a quiet counterpoint to the turmoil within. Amelia nodded, her gaze fixed on the delicate blossoms. Neither did I, she replied, a faint tremor in her voice. The unspoken words hung between them, the shared loss, the unexpected reunion, the betrayal that had brought them together. The weight of their shared past, heavy and palpable, filled the space between them. It's strange, Isabella continued, her voice catching slightly, to find you like this. She glanced at Amelia, her eyes searching for understanding. A flicker of something akin to hope danced in their depths. Amelia smiled. A small, fragile thing, but genuine. Strange and wonderful, she corrected gently, her voice thick with emotion. The years of loneliness, the aching void in her heart, began to fill with the unexpected presence of her twin. The initial anger, the raw betrayal, were slowly receding, replaced by a burgeoning sense of connection. A shared understanding born of hardship and unexpected kinship. The sunlight seemed to warm the room, casting a golden glow upon the two women, a tangible symbol of the fragile hope beginning to bloom between them. The silence that followed wasn't empty, but filled with the unspoken promise of a new beginning, a shared journey of healing and rediscovery. The scent of the wildflowers, sweet and fresh, seemed to mirror the newfound lightness in their hearts. The muted tones of Julian's study felt heavier than usual. Rain lashed against the tall windows, mirroring the tempest inside him. He sat hunched over a half-empty glass of whiskey, the amber liquid doing little to soothe the burning guilt. He hadn't seen Amelia in days, her withdrawal a silent accusation more potent than any shouted words. Isabella, meanwhile, flitted around the house like a restless spirit, her usual vibrancy dimmed by a gnawing uncertainty. "She won't even answer my calls," he muttered, the words barely audible above the drumming rain. Isabella, perched on the edge of a plush armchair, watched him with a mixture of pity and concern. Her own eyes were red-rimmed, the mascara smudged.